Hey there, folks. Welcome to our cozy nook of tales and adventures. Today, like every episode, we're unlocking the doors of imagination to explore new worlds, meet fascinating characters, and experience unique emotions. I promise to take you on an unforgettable journey through the power of words. So get comfy, grab your favorite drink, snuggle into that perfect spot, and get ready to lose yourself in a new story. Leave the outside world behind for a while and dive with me into the depths of storytelling. If you enjoy our content and want to support the channel, consider hitting the subscribe button and giving the video a thumbs up. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's story. In the quiet days of the Third Age, when the world still held pockets of untouched wonder and the old magic lingered in forgotten places, there came a time when Gandalf the Grey found himself wandering the peaceful lands south of Bree. The autumn had painted the countryside in shades of amber and russet, and the air carried the sweet scent of ripening apples and turning leaves. The wizard walked without haste, his staff tapping gently against the worn stones of the old road, for he had no pressing errand, and the weather was fair. It was in these unhurried travels that Gandalf first heard whispers of a curious phenomenon in the small village of Greenhollow. The village nestled in a shallow vale between two gentle hills, a place so unremarkable that most maps did not bother to mark its existence. Yet the travellers who passed through the inn at Bree spoke of it with puzzled wonder. They told of a garden that had begun to glow at night, not with fire or lamplight, but with a soft radiance like starlight captured in dewdrops. The phenomenon had started slowly, they said, just a faint shimmer on certain flowers. But with each passing week, the luminescence grew stronger and spread to more of the garden, until the entire plot shone like a piece of the night sky brought down to earth. The innkeeper at Bree, a stout man named Butterbur who had known Gandalf for many years, shared what he had heard from a merchant who had stayed 3 nights prior. The garden belonged to an elderly woman named Eleanor Greaves, a widow who had tended her flowers and herbs for longer than anyone in Greenhollow could remember. She was not alarmed by the strange light, the merchant had said, but the other villagers were growing anxious. Some whispered of elven enchantments. Others spoke of omens and portents, though none could agree whether the sign boded well or ill. Gandalf listened to these accounts with interest, though he said little in reply. He puffed thoughtfully on his pipe, watching the smoke rings drift lazily toward the ceiling beams of the inn. When Butterbur had finished his tale, the wizard simply nodded, paid for his meal and room, and announced that he would travel to Greenhollow on the morrow. The innkeeper was not surprised. He had known Gandalf long enough to recognize that look in the old wizard's eye, the quiet curiosity that drew him to mysteries both great and small. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that spoke of the approaching winter. Gandalf set out early, following the winding country lanes that led south and west from Bree. The road was little more than a cart track in places, bordered by hedgerows heavy with blackberries and wild roses gone to hip. He passed through drowsy hamlets where farmers were bringing in the last of the harvest, and children played in the stubble fields, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. As he walked, Gandalf pondered the nature of the phenomenon he had heard described. In his long years of wandering Middle-earth, he had encountered many strange and wondrous things. He had seen the light of the Eldar in Rivendell and Lothlorien, where every leaf and stone seemed touched by an inner radiance. He had witnessed the fell glow of dark sorcery in places corrupted by shadow. But a garden that shone with starlight in a quiet village of men, this was something new, something that piqued his ancient curiosity. The sun was past its zenith when Gandalf crested a rise and looked down into the Vale of Greenhollow. The village was exactly as he had imagined it, a cluster of perhaps 30 cottages with thatched roofs and whitewashed walls, gathered around a small green where an ancient oak spread its branches. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and he could see figures moving about their daily tasks. A mill wheel turned slowly beside a clear stream that wound through the vale, and beyond the village, fields of stubble and fallow ground stretched toward the surrounding hills. Gandalf made his way down the slope and entered the village, drawing curious glances from those he passed. Strangers were not common in Greenhollow, and a wizard was rarer still, though a few of the older villagers seemed to recognize what manner of traveller had come among them. They nodded respectfully as he passed, and one old man called out a greeting, which Gandalf returned with a smile and a touch of his staff to his wide-brimmed hat. In the centre of the village, near the green, Gandalf found what he sought, A cottage stood slightly apart from the others, its garden stretching before it in neat rows and beds. Even in the full light of afternoon, Gandalf could sense something different about this place. The air seemed clearer here, the colours more vivid. The flowers that still bloomed, late roses and autumn asters, seemed to hold their petals with unusual brightness, and there was a quality to the light that fell upon them, as if they gathered and held the sunshine in a way that other plants did not. At the garden gate stood a woman of advanced years, her white hair bound in a simple braid, her hands gnarled but steady as she pruned a climbing rose. She looked up as Gandalf approached, and her weathered face showed no surprise, only a calm acknowledgement, as if she had been expecting him. Her eyes were clear and grey, holding a depth that reminded Gandalf of still water reflecting the stars. "Good day to you, Eleanor Greaves," said Gandalf, touching the brim of his hat in respectful greeting. "I am Gandalf, called the Grey, and I have travelled from Bree to see your remarkable garden." The woman set down her pruning shears and wiped her hands on her apron, a small smile touching her lips. "I knew someone would come eventually," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "The others in the village, they worry and whisper, but they do not understand. I am glad it is you who has come, Gandalf the Grey. I have heard tales of your wisdom and your kindness." She opened the gate and gestured for him to enter. "Come, walk with me among the flowers. They are sleeping now in the daylight, but even so, you may sense what makes them different." Gandalf stepped into the garden, and immediately he felt a change in the air around him. It was subtle, like the difference between standing in shadow and standing in a shaft of gentle sunlight, but it was unmistakable. There was a peace here, a quietness that went deeper than mere absence of sound. The wizard walked slowly along the narrow paths between the flower beds, his keen eyes taking in every detail. The garden was beautifully tended, with not a weed to be seen among the carefully arranged plantings. Roses climbed wooden trellises, their late blooms still fragrant. Beds of herbs, lavender and rosemary and thyme, filled the air with their scent. Autumn flowers, chrysanthemums and asters, dahlias and late-blooming lilies nodded on their stems. But it was not the variety or arrangement of the plants that held Gandalf's attention. It was something else, something he could not quite name. Each flower, each leaf, seemed to possess a quality of waiting, as if they were holding something precious within themselves, saving it for the proper moment to reveal. "Tell me," said Gandalf, turning to Eleanor, who had followed him into the garden, "when did this begin? When did you first notice the light?" Eleanor folded her hands before her, her gaze travelling over the garden she had tended for so many years. "It started in the spring," she said, her voice taking on a distant quality, as if she were looking back through the months. "My husband, Thomas, passed away last winter. We had been married for 47 years, and this garden was our shared joy. Every plant here we chose together, placed together, tended together. When he died, I thought the garden would feel empty, that it would remind me only of loss. But spring came, as it always does, and the flowers bloomed as they always had." She paused, reaching out to touch the petal of a late rose with gentle fingers. "One evening in early May, I came out here at dusk to close the gate, and I saw it, just a faint glow, like the last light of sunset caught in the petals of the primroses. I thought my old eyes were playing tricks on me, that grief had addled my mind, but the next night it was there again, a little brighter, and the night after that, brighter still. By the time summer came, half the garden was shining in the darkness. Now, as autumn deepens, nearly every flower holds the light." Gandalf listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "And you are not afraid?" he asked gently. "The light does not trouble you?" Eleanor shook her head, her eyes meeting his with perfect calm. "No," she said simply. "I am not afraid. The light is beautiful, and it brings me comfort. When I sit in my cottage at night and look out at the garden, it is as if all the stars have come down to keep me company, as if Thomas somehow found a way to leave me a gift, a reminder that beauty and wonder still exist in the world, even in sorrow." The wizard nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "But the others in the village, they do not share your peace with it?" Eleanor sighed, a sound of gentle resignation. "They are good people, but they fear what they do not understand. Some say the garden is bewitched, that I have trafficked with elves or worse. Others say it is an omen, a warning of something terrible to come. A few have stopped speaking to me altogether, as if the strangeness might somehow spread if they come too near. Only old Willem, who knew Thomas well, still visits, and he only in daylight. Gandalf's brow furrowed with concern. And has anyone tried to harm the garden? To uproot the plants or destroy them? Not yet, Eleanor replied, though I have heard the whispers. There are some, led by the blacksmith's son, a man named Oswald, who say the garden should be burned, that unnatural things must be purged before they bring doom upon the village. So far, the older heads have counselled patience, but I fear that patience may not last much longer. If the light continues to grow stronger, as it has been, I do not know what they might do. The wizard was quiet for a long moment, standing among the waiting flowers, feeling the strange peace that permeated this place. He had encountered many mysteries in his long years, had witnessed wonders both terrible and sublime, but there was something about this gentle garden, glowing with captured starlight in a quiet village, that touched him deeply. It spoke to him of things that could not be measured by power or might, but only by love and memory, by the quiet persistence of beauty in the face of sorrow. "I would like to stay, if you will have me," said Gandalf at last, "to see the garden as night falls, to witness this light for myself. Perhaps together we might understand what has caused it, and more importantly, what it means." Eleanor's face brightened with relief and gratitude. "You are most welcome," she said. "I have a spare room, small but clean, and my cooking is simple but wholesome. It would be a comfort to have company, especially company that does not look upon my garden with suspicion and fear." And so it was arranged. Gandalf settled his few belongings in the small guest room at the back of the cottage, a cosy space with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a window that looked out over the garden. Eleanor prepared a simple meal of vegetable soup and fresh bread, and they ate together at her small kitchen table as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. They spoke of many things, of the changing seasons and the old days, of Thomas and the life he and Eleanor had built together in this quiet place. Thomas was a carpenter, Eleanor told him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes soft with memory. He made beautiful things, furniture and carvings, but his true love was always this garden. He said that working with wood taught him patience and precision, but working with living things taught him wonder. Every year we would plan what to plant, where to place each flower for the best light, the best soil. He knew every plant by name, spoke to them as if they were old friends. Gandalf listened with the patience of one who understood that some stories needed to be told, that memory was a bridge between past and present. "He sounds like a man of great wisdom," the wizard said gently. "To find wonder in simple things is a rare gift." Eleanor nodded, a tear glistening at the corner of her eye. "He was good," she said simply. "Kind and patient and good. When he became ill last autumn, he made me promise that I would not let the garden fall to neglect, that I would tend it as we always had together. I have kept that promise, every day since he passed." As they spoke, the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Gandalf could see through the window how the light changed in the garden, how the flowers seemed to lift their faces toward the fading day. Eleanor rose and began to light the lamps in the cottage, but Gandalf asked her to leave them dark. "Let us sit in the twilight," he suggested. "I wish to see the garden as the night comes, without other light to confuse the eye." They moved to chairs by the window, and Gandalf filled his pipe, the small glow of the pipeweed briefly illuminating his weathered face. Outside, the sky deepened from blue to indigo to the rich purple of early night. The first stars began to appear, faint points of silver in the darkening vault of heaven. And as the natural light faded, another light began to grow in the garden below. It started subtly, as Eleanor had described, just a faint luminescence in the hearts of the flowers. The white roses seemed to glow first, their petals holding a soft radiance like moonlight on snow. Then the other flowers began to join them, each in its own time. The deep purple asters shimmered with an inner light that made them appear almost translucent. The golden chrysanthemums blazed gently, like captured sunshine. Even the leaves of the plants took on a subtle glow, as if the very sap that ran through them carried light instead of water. Gandalf sat transfixed, his pipe forgotten in his hand. He had seen the light of the Eldar, had walked in gardens where every leaf was touched by the ancient power of the firstborn. But this was different. This light was gentler, more intimate, a soft radiance that spoke not of power or eternity, but of love and remembrance. It was as if the garden itself had become a living memory, a testament to the devotion of two people who had tended it together through the turning of the years. As full darkness fell, the garden blazed with quiet glory. Every flower, every plant contributed its own soft light to the whole, creating a tapestry of gentle radiance that seemed to hold back the night. The effect was breathtaking, like looking at a piece of the night sky brought down to earth, or like seeing the stars reflected in a still pond, but more real, more present. Gandalf could feel the peace that emanated from the garden, a deep tranquility that seemed to settle over the cottage like a blessing. "Do you understand it now?" Eleanor asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what causes the light?" Gandalf was slow to answer, choosing his words with care. "I believe," he said at last, "that what we are witnessing is something rare and precious. This garden was tended with love for many years, by two hearts that worked as one. That love, that devotion, has seeped into the very soil, into the roots and stems and petals of every plant. And when Thomas passed, that love did not die. It remained, held in the living things he had cherished." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his eyes never leaving the luminous garden before them. "The light you see is not enchantment in the way the villagers fear," Gandalf continued. "It is not the work of elves or spirits, nor is it a portent of doom. Rather, it is something more profound. It is love made visible, memory given form. The garden remembers the hands that tended it, the care that was lavished upon it, and in remembering, it shines, as if to say that such devotion does not simply vanish when one passes from this world." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, tears streaming quietly down her weathered cheeks. "Then it is Thomas," she whispered. "In a way, he is still here. Not his spirit," Gandalf said gently, "but the mark he left upon the world, the love he poured into this place. That kind of love, freely given without thought of reward, has a power of its own. It transforms the things it touches. Your garden has become a living testament to that love, and it will shine for as long as the memory of it endures." They sat together in the peaceful darkness, watching the garden glow. Gandalf felt the rightness of this place, the quiet sanctity of it. He understood now why Eleanor felt no fear, why she drew comfort from the light. It was a gift, a final expression of a love that had defined two lives. But he also understood the fear of the villagers, for they did not have the knowledge or experience to see beyond the strangeness of it. To them, it was simply something that defied explanation, and what could not be explained was often feared. The next morning dawned grey and damp, with a soft rain falling from low clouds. Gandalf woke early and found Eleanor already up, preparing breakfast in her small kitchen. They ate together in companionable silence, and afterward, Gandalf announced his intention to speak with the villagers, to help them understand what they were witnessing. Eleanor looked worried at this suggestion. "They will not listen to me," she said. "Why would they listen to a stranger, even a wizard?" "Because," said Gandalf with a gentle smile, "sometimes it takes an outside voice to be heard. And because I have seen many things in my long years, and I may be able to speak to their fears in a way that brings comfort rather than dismissal." He donned his cloak and took up his staff, and together they walked to the village green. Word of the wizard's presence had spread quickly through the small community, and by the time Gandalf reached the green, a crowd had already gathered. There were perhaps 40 or 50 people, men and women of all ages, farmers and craftsmen, shopkeepers and labourers. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and wariness, hope and suspicion. At the front of the crowd stood a burly man with a thick beard and strong arms, the blacksmith's son that Eleanor had mentioned. Oswald was his name, and his face was set in hard lines of disapproval. "You are the wizard who came to see the witch's garden," Oswald called out, his voice carrying across the green. "Have you come to tell us that her unnatural lights are harmless, that we should simply accept this strangeness in our midst?" Gandalf regarded the man with calm eyes, leaning lightly on his staff. "I have come to tell you what I have learned," he replied, his voice quiet but clear. "Whether you choose to accept it or fear it remains your own decision. But I would ask that you listen before you judge." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Gandalf could sense their uncertainty. They wanted answers, wanted to understand what was happening in their quiet village. He began to speak, telling them of what he had witnessed the night before, of the gentle light that filled Eleanor's garden. He spoke of love and memory, of the power that devotion could hold even after death. He explained that the light was not dark magic or elven enchantment, but something far simpler and more profound, the visible echo of a love that had been poured into the earth for nearly 5 decades. Some in the crowd seemed to soften at his words, their faces losing some of their hardness. But Oswald remained unmoved. "Pretty words from a wanderer," he said, his voice thick with scorn. "But words do not change what is unnatural. A garden that glows in the dark is wrong, no matter what honeyed explanations you offer. It is a disruption of the proper order of things, and such disruptions always lead to trouble. Better to root it out now, before whatever curse lies upon it spreads to the rest of the village." Gandalf turned his full attention to Oswald, and though his voice remained gentle, there was a weight to his words that made even the boldest in the crowd take notice. "Tell me, friend, what harm has this garden done? Has anyone fallen ill? Have crops failed? Have misfortunes befallen those who live near it?" Oswald shifted uncomfortably, but his jaw remained set. "Not yet," he replied. "But such things take time. Evil grows slowly, like rot in timber. By the time you see the damage on the surface, the corruption has already spread deep within." "It is true that some evils work slowly," Gandalf acknowledged, "but it is also true that not everything strange is evil, and not everything that defies our understanding is a threat. I have walked this world for longer than any of you can imagine, and I have learned to recognize the difference between darkness and light, even when that light takes an unfamiliar form. What grows in Eleanor's garden is not corruption, but its opposite. It is a rare and beautiful thing, a gift that most of us will never witness in our lifetimes." An older woman near the front of the crowd, her grey hair bound in a kerchief, spoke up. Her voice was uncertain but sincere. "I knew Thomas Greaves for 40 years, she said. "He was my neighbour, and as good a man as ever lived in this village. If his love for that garden could somehow linger after his passing, I do not see how that could be an evil thing. Her husband loved her truly, and she loved him the same. If their devotion left a mark upon the world, perhaps we should honour it rather than fear it." Several others murmured agreement, and Gandalf could see the crowd beginning to divide. Some, particularly the older villagers who had known Thomas, seemed willing to accept his explanation. Others, especially some of the younger folk who had not known the carpenter well, still looked uncertain or hostile. Oswald noticed the shifting mood and pressed his case more forcefully. "You speak of love and devotion," he said, addressing the crowd rather than Gandalf. "But I say we cannot afford to take such risks based on the word of a stranger, wizard or not. What if he is wrong? What if this light is the first sign of some terrible enchantment that will bring ruin upon us all? Can we gamble the safety of our children, our homes, on pretty stories about devotion and memory?" The crowd grew restless, torn between fear and hope, between the comfort of destroying what they did not understand and the risk of honouring something that might indeed be precious. Gandalf could see that words alone would not be enough to convince them, not when fear had taken such deep root. He needed to show them something more, something that would speak to their hearts rather than their minds. "Very well," he said at last, his voice rising to carry across the green. "If words are not sufficient, then let us put the matter to a test. Tonight, when darkness falls, I invite all of you to come to Eleanor's garden. See the light for yourselves. Stand among the flowers and feel what emanates from that place. If any among you, after witnessing it with your own eyes and your own heart, still believes it to be a source of evil or corruption, then I will help you uproot it myself." This pronouncement caused a stir of surprise and discussion. Oswald looked suspicious, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of trick, but Gandalf's offer had been made publicly, and the crowd was already murmuring their acceptance. How could they refuse such a reasonable proposal? The wizard was willing to let them judge for themselves, to make their own determination based on direct experience rather than rumour and fear. The meeting on the green broke up shortly after, with the villagers dispersing to their homes and shops, already discussing what they would do when evening came. Gandalf and Eleanor walked back to the cottage together, the soft rain still falling around them. "Do you truly think they will understand?" Eleanor asked, worry clear in her voice. "Or will they simply see strangeness and be all the more determined to destroy it?" "I do not know," Gandalf admitted honestly. "But I believe that most people, when given the chance to experience beauty directly, will recognize it for what it is. Fear thrives in darkness and ignorance. When we bring it into the light, when we face it honestly, it often loses its power over us. Tonight, they will see your garden not as some distant, frightening mystery, but as a real place they can walk through and touch. That may make all the difference. They spent the afternoon in quiet preparation. Eleanor tended her garden as she always did, trimming dead leaves and pulling the few weeds that had dared to sprout. Gandalf sat on a bench and smoked his pipe, occasionally offering a word of encouragement or a gentle observation about this plant or that. The rain stopped around midday, and the clouds began to break apart, allowing shafts of pale sunlight to illuminate the vale. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared entirely, revealing the deep blue of autumn twilight. As the sun began to set, villagers started to arrive. They came in small groups, families walking together, neighbors gathering courage from one another's presence. Some came out of curiosity, others out of concern, and a few, like old Willem, who had been Thomas's friend, came out of loyalty and love. They gathered outside the garden gate, perhaps 60 or 70 people in all, nearly the entire population of Greenhollow. Eleanor stood by the gate to welcome them, her face pale but composed. Gandalf stood beside her, a reassuring presence. "Welcome, friends," Gandalf said, his voice warm and inviting. "Thank you for coming. I ask only that you enter with open hearts and minds. Walk among the flowers. Touch the leaves if you wish. Sit on the benches that Thomas built with his own hands. Let the garden speak to you in its own way, and then judge for yourselves what manner of place this is." The villagers filed in slowly, hesitantly, as if stepping onto sacred ground. Children clung to their parents' hands, eyes wide with wonder and a little fear. The older folk moved more confidently, remembering the many times they had visited this garden when Thomas was alive, when it had been a place of simple beauty and neighborly conversation. The sky deepened through shades of rose and amber as the sun sank below the hills. Gandalf watched the faces of the villagers as they dispersed throughout the garden, some staying near the gate, others venturing deeper among the flower beds. There was tension in the air, anticipation mixed with apprehension. Oswald had positioned himself near the center of the garden, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical and watchful. He had brought several of his friends with him, young men who shared his suspicion of anything that deviated from the ordinary. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky, small points of silver light against the deepening blue. And as they did, the garden began its transformation. It started, as it always did, with the white roses. Their petals began to glow with a soft radiance, gentle as candlelight but purer, cleaner. A woman standing near one of the rose bushes gasped softly and reached out to touch a glowing petal. Her fingers trembled as they made contact, and then her face relaxed into an expression of wonder. "It is warm," she whispered to her husband. "Not hot, but warm, like sunshine on a spring morning." The light spread through the garden like a slow wave. The purple asters began to shimmer, their petals translucent and luminous. The golden chrysanthemums blazed softly, each flower a small sun in the gathering darkness. The late-blooming dahlias contributed their own shades of pink and red and orange, all transformed into gentle light. Even the herb beds joined in, the silver-grey leaves of the lavender taking on a subtle glow, the rosemary shimmering like moonlight on water. Within minutes, the entire garden was alight, a tapestry of soft radiance that seemed to hold back the night without diminishing the stars above. The effect on the villagers was profound. All conversation had ceased, replaced by a hushed silence, broken only by occasional whispers of amazement. Children who had been frightened now moved among the glowing flowers with delight, their faces reflecting the gentle light. Parents who had come prepared to condemn now stood transfixed, their earlier certainty dissolving in the face of such unexpected beauty. Even some of Oswald's companions had wandered away from his side, drawn by the peaceful luminescence that filled the garden. Gandalf remained near the gate with Eleanor, observing the transformation taking place not in the garden, but in the hearts of those who walked through it. He could see it in their faces, the way their shoulders relaxed, the way their expressions softened. The garden was working its quiet magic, not through enchantment or sorcery, but through simple beauty offered without demand or expectation. An old man, Willem, who had been Thomas's friend, made his way to one of the wooden benches and sat down heavily. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked around at the glowing flowers. "This is Thomas," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. This is exactly like him. He always brought light to dark places, always found ways to make the world a little more beautiful. Of course his love would leave such a mark. Of course it would shine. His words seemed to release something in the others. Several people came forward to embrace Eleanor, offering words of apology for their suspicion and fear. "I am sorry," said the woman who had touched the first glowing rose. "We should have known that anything touched by Thomas's hand could only be good." Another villager, a farmer whose fields bordered Eleanor's property, shook his head in wonder. "I have walked past this garden every day, for months, seeing the strange light and thinking dark thoughts. But standing here now, I feel only peace. How could I have been so blind?" Not everyone was convinced. Oswald still stood in the center of the garden, his face troubled, struggling to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had believed. Gandalf could see the war being waged in the man's heart, fear and wonder locked in combat. The wizard approached him quietly, leaving Eleanor to receive the apologies and embraces of her neighbors. "Tell me what you feel," Gandalf said gently. "Not what you think you should feel, but what your heart tells you in this moment." Oswald was silent for a long time, his eyes moving from flower to flower, taking in the gentle radiance that surrounded him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I feel peace," he admitted, the words seeming to cost him great effort. "I feel as though I have stepped into a place outside of time where nothing can harm me. But that frightens me more than if I felt darkness or evil. I do not understand it, and I have always feared what I cannot understand." Gandalf nodded slowly, recognizing the honesty in the man's confession. "That is the burden of being human," he said quietly. "You are given hearts that long for wonder, yet minds that demand explanation. The two are often at war with each other. But tell me, Oswald, when you look at your children playing among these glowing flowers, their faces filled with joy, what does your heart tell you then?" Oswald's gaze found his two young sons, who were chasing each other between the flower beds, laughing as the luminous petals brushed against their arms and faces. The light reflected in their eyes, making them seem like small stars themselves. The big man's shoulders sagged, and something that had been held rigid within him began to soften. "My heart tells me that they are safe," he said at last, "that this place means them no harm, that perhaps I have been guarding against the wrong things, protecting them from beauty when I should have been teaching them to recognize it." The wizard placed a gentle hand on Oswald's shoulder. "That is wisdom speaking, my friend. It takes great courage to admit when our fears have led us astray. There is no shame in it, only the opportunity to choose a different path." Oswald looked at Gandalf, and in his eyes the wizard saw the last of the resistance crumbling. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I let fear blind me to what was right in front of me. Thomas was a good man, better than I will ever be. If his love left this mark upon the world, then it is a mark to be treasured, not destroyed." He turned and made his way to where Eleanor stood, surrounded by her neighbors. The crowd parted to let him through, and when he reached her, he removed his cap and held it awkwardly in his hands. "Mistress Greaves," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet garden, "I owe you an apology. I spoke out of ignorance and fear, and I am ashamed of the things I said. Your garden is a wonder, a gift to all of us. Please forgive me." Eleanor took his rough hands in her own smaller ones, her eyes kind. "There is nothing to forgive, Oswald. You were protecting your family, your home. That comes from love too, even if it sometimes leads us to see threats where none exist. I am just glad you have seen the truth now. Thomas would have liked you, you know. He always respected men who worked with their hands and cared for their families." The tension that had hung over the gathering dissolved like morning mist. The villagers began to move more freely through the garden, examining flowers more closely, sitting on the benches, gathering in small groups to talk in hushed, wondering voices. Some of the children had begun to play a game, trying to catch the light in their cupped hands, laughing when it seemed to slip through their fingers like water. Their parents watched with smiles, no longer afraid to let their young ones interact with the mysterious radiance. Gandalf found himself standing alone for a moment near a bed of glowing irises. He felt a deep satisfaction settling over him, the contentment that came from seeing fear transformed into understanding, suspicion into acceptance. This was the work he had been sent to Middle-earth to do, not grand battles against Dark Lords, but quiet interventions in the lives of ordinary people. helping them to see the light that already existed in their world, if only they would open their eyes to it. As the night deepened and the stars grew brighter overhead, the villagers began to depart, but slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving a place they had only just discovered and already knew they would miss. They filed past Eleanor one by one or in small family groups, offering thanks and blessings, promises to visit again. Many said they would come back the next night, and the night after, to walk in the glowing garden and remember Thomas, to draw comfort from the visible proof that love could indeed transcend death. When the last of them had gone, only Gandalf and Eleanor remained in the luminous garden. They sat together on one of the benches Thomas had built, watching the flowers sway gently in the night breeze, their light undiminished by the darkness around them. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. "Without your help, I do not know what would have happened. They might have destroyed it all, and I would have been powerless to stop them." Gandalf shook his head. "I merely helped them to see what was already there. The change happened in their own hearts, when they allowed themselves to experience the garden rather than simply judge it from a distance. That is the great challenge we all face, to quiet our fears long enough to perceive the truth." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the soft sounds of the night. An owl called from the woods beyond the village, its voice a gentle counterpoint to the whisper of wind through the glowing flowers. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, ancient and constant, and the garden's light seemed to answer them, earth speaking to sky in a language older than words. "Tell me about Thomas," Gandalf said after a time. "What was he like when you first met him?" Eleanor's face softened with memory, and she settled more comfortably on the bench, her eyes distant with recollection. "I was 17, she began, and he was 19. He came to our village as an apprentice carpenter, learning his trade from old Master Thornwood. I first saw him at the harvest festival, standing off to one side, watching the dancing but too shy to join in. He had sawdust in his hair and calluses on his hands, and when I asked him why he did not dance, he said he was better with wood than with words." She smiled at the memory, her fingers absently touching the armrest of the bench they sat on, worn smooth by years of use. "I told him that was all right, that not everyone needed to be clever with words. He asked if he could walk with me by the river, and we spent the whole evening just walking and talking, or rather, I talked and he listened. That was how it always was between us. I was the one with words, and he was the one with patient silence and steady hands." "And when did you begin the garden together?" Gandalf asked gently. Eleanor's expression grew even more tender. "The spring after we married," she replied. "We had this cottage, just the two of us, and the land in front was nothing but weeds and wild grass. Thomas said that a home needed a garden, that we should plant things that would grow with us through the years. So we started with just a few flowers, roses and daisies. Simple things. But each year we added more, trying new plants, learning what would thrive in this soil and what would not." She gestured to the glowing beds around them. "That bed of irises there, we planted those the year our first child was born. She died before her first birthday, a fever that the healers could not cure. Thomas carved a small wooden angel and buried it beneath the irises, and every year when they bloomed, we would remember her together. The lavender came, the year we learned we could have no more children. Thomas said we needed something that would spread and fill the empty spaces, something that would remind us that loss can transform into something beautiful if we let it." Gandalf listened with the deep attention he gave to all stories that mattered, understanding that Eleanor needed to speak these memories aloud, to give them voice in the presence of someone who would truly hear them. "And these roses?" he asked, indicating a particularly magnificent climbing rose that covered a wooden trellis, its flowers blazing with soft white light. "Those were Thomas's pride," Eleanor said with a soft laugh. "He spent 5 years coaxing them to climb that trellis just right. He would talk to them. Can you believe it? Every morning when he went out to work, he would greet them and tell them what a fine day it was for growing. I used to tease him about it, but the roses bloomed more beautifully for him than for any other gardener in the region. I think they knew they were loved." The wizard nodded slowly. "Love has power," he said quietly. "More power than many realize. It is the force that holds back the darkness, the light that refuses to be extinguished. What you and Thomas created here was not just a garden, but a sanctuary, a place where love could grow and flourish and be made visible. That is why it shines now. That is why the light will not fade, as long as the memory of that love endures. How long will it last? Eleanor asked, a touch of worry entering her voice. Will the light fade when I am gone? Will the garden return to being ordinary? Gandalf considered the question carefully before answering. I do not think it will fade entirely, he said at last. What has been so deeply established, what has been nurtured for so many years, does not simply vanish. The light may dim eventually, as all things in Middle-earth must change with time. But I believe that this place will always hold a special quality, a sense of peace and sanctuary that those who visit it will feel, even if they cannot name its source. He looked around at the glowing garden, his ancient eyes taking in every detail. Places can hold memory, just as people do. Sacred groves, ancient halls, battlefields where great deeds were done. All of these carry echoes of what transpired there. Your garden has become such a place, a testament to a love that was pure and true and freely given. Those who come here in years to come may not see the light as we see it now, but they will feel something, a whisper of the devotion that shaped this earth. Eleanor drew her shawl closer around her shoulders, though the night was not cold. That brings me comfort, she said softly, to know that Thomas's love will not be entirely forgotten, that some trace of what we built together will remain. We had no children to carry on our memory, no great works that will be remembered in songs or stories, just this garden and the quiet life we lived together. But perhaps that is enough. It is more than enough, Gandalf assured her. The world is built not on grand gestures and great deeds alone, but on countless small acts of love and devotion. Every flower planted with care, every kind word spoken, every moment of beauty shared, these are the threads that weave the fabric of a good life. You and Thomas understood that, and you lived it fully. That is a greater accomplishment than many who are remembered in history can claim. They remained in the garden until the moon rose, a silver crescent that added its own gentle light to the luminescence of the flowers. Eventually, the coolness of the night air drove them inside, where Eleanor prepared tea, and they sat by the fire, talking of small things and comfortable silences. When at last they retired to their separate rooms, Gandalf lay awake for a time, thinking about what he had witnessed in this quiet village, about the transformative power of simple love. The next 3 days passed peacefully in Green Hollow. True to their word, many of the villagers returned each evening to walk in the glowing garden. They came with reverence now, speaking in hushed voices, careful not to disturb the flowers or damage the carefully tended beds. Children played gently among the luminous blooms while their parents sat on the benches and talked of their own memories of Thomas, sharing stories that Eleanor had never heard, small kindnesses and quiet generosities that the carpenter had performed throughout his life. Oswald came every evening with his family, and on the second night he brought something with him, a small wooden box that he presented to Eleanor with awkward formality. My father was a carpenter too, he explained as she opened it. He and Thomas were friends when they were young, before my father passed. I found this among his things after he died, and I think Thomas would have wanted you to have it. Inside the box was a collection of small wooden carvings, animals and birds and flowers, each one exquisitely detailed. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she examined them. Thomas made these, she whispered. In the early years of our marriage, before his hands grew too stiff for such fine work, I thought they were all lost. Oh, Oswald, thank you. Thank you for bringing these back to me. The blacksmith's son shifted uncomfortably, clearly moved by her reaction. It seemed right, he said simply. After what I almost did, after how I spoke about your garden, it seemed the least I could do to make amends. Eleanor embraced him, and Gandalf watched from a distance, pleased to see how the crisis had transformed into connection, how fear had given way to compassion. On the fourth morning, Gandalf announced to Eleanor that he would be leaving soon. His presence had served its purpose, and there were other roads calling to him, other places where he might be needed. Eleanor accepted this with good grace, though he could see the sadness in her eyes. You have given me such a gift, she said as they stood together in the garden one last time in daylight, not just in helping the villagers understand, but in helping me understand as well. I thought the light was simply a comfort, a mystery to be grateful for, but you have shown me what it truly represents, and that knowledge makes it even more precious. Gandalf smiled gently. The light was always what it is, he said. I simply helped you put words to what your heart already knew. You have nothing to fear from it, Eleanor. Let it shine as long as it will, and let it bring comfort, not only to you, but to all who see it. In this troubled world, we need such reminders that love endures, that beauty persists, that the good we do in life echoes beyond our mortal span. Before he departed, several of the villagers came to bid him farewell. Old Willem clasped his hand with surprising strength. "You have done us a great service, wizard," he said, "not just in explaining the garden, but in reminding us to see with our hearts as well as our eyes. That is a lesson we sorely needed." Others echoed similar sentiments, thanking him for his wisdom and his patience. Even the youngest children gathered around, begging him to conjure fireworks or perform some magical feat. Gandalf obliged them with a few simple tricks, sending coloured sparks dancing through the air and making flowers bloom instantly from seeds, much to their delight. As the sun reached its zenith, Gandalf shouldered his pack and took up his staff. Eleanor walked with him to the edge of the village, where the road led back toward Bree and the wider world beyond. They stood together for a moment, the wizard tall and grey, the elderly woman small and worn but somehow radiant, with a quiet joy that had not been there when he first arrived. "Farewell, Eleanor Greaves," Gandalf said, his voice warm with affection. "Tend your garden well, and let its light be a beacon for all who need reminding that love is the strongest force in this world. I do not think we shall meet again in this life, but I am glad to have known you, and grateful to have witnessed the beauty that you and Thomas created together. Farewell, Gandalf the Grey," Eleanor replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You came as a stranger, but leave as a friend. May your road be safe, and may you find other gardens along the way, other places where light still shines against the darkness." She reached into her pocket and drew out a small packet of seeds. "These are from the white roses," she said. "Plant them somewhere on your travels, somewhere they will be cared for. Let them carry a bit of Thomas's light to other corners of the world." Gandalf accepted the packet with solemn gratitude, tucking it carefully into an inner pocket of his robes. "I will plant them in a place of honor," he promised, "and I will remember this garden and the lesson it taught, that the smallest acts of devotion can create wonders that endure long after we have passed from the world." With a final nod and a gentle smile, he turned and began walking up the road, his staff tapping rhythmically against the stones. Eleanor stood watching until he disappeared over the rise, a grey figure becoming one with the grey road, until she could no longer distinguish him from the play of light and shadow on the distant hills. Then she turned and made her way back to her cottage, back to her glowing garden, and to the life that awaited her there. But something had changed in her heart. A weight she had not even known she carried had been lifted. She understood now that the light was not just a mystery or a comfort, but a gift, both to herself and to all who would come to see it. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm in Green Hollow. The garden became a gathering place for the village, especially in the evenings when the light was strongest. People would come after their work was done, sitting on the benches or walking slowly along the paths, finding peace in the gentle radiance. Some brought their troubles to the garden, sitting in silence among the glowing flowers until their burdens seemed lighter. Others brought their joys, celebrating births and betrothals beneath the luminous blooms, as if seeking a blessing from the love that had created this place. Eleanor found herself no longer alone in her grief. The villagers who came to see the garden also came to see her, bringing small gifts of food or helping with tasks that had grown difficult for her aging hands. Oswald, true to his change of heart, took it upon himself to maintain the wooden structures Thomas had built, repairing benches and trellises, ensuring that the physical framework of the garden remained sound. His children often helped him, learning carpentry at their father's side, just as Thomas had learned it long ago from Master Thornwood. As autumn deepened toward winter, the garden continued to glow, though the flowers began to fade as they always did with the changing season. But even as the blooms withered and fell, the light did not diminish. It seemed to move into the very stems and leaves, into the bare branches and sleeping roots, as if the essence of what made the garden special had seeped so deeply into its nature that no season could take it away. The first snows came, covering the beds in a blanket of white, and still the light shone through, turning the snow itself into a carpet of soft radiance. Travellers began to hear of the Starlight Garden in Green Hollow, and some made detours from their routes to see it for themselves. They would arrive skeptical, having heard tales that seemed too fantastical to believe, but they would leave changed, touched by the quiet beauty they had witnessed. Word spread slowly through the lands around Bree. carried by merchants and wanderers, until the garden became known throughout the region as a place of peace and healing, a sanctuary where the weary could find rest. Eleanor lived for 5 more years after Gandalf's visit, and in that time she saw her garden bring comfort to hundreds of souls. She tended it faithfully until the very end, and when at last she passed from the world on a quiet spring morning, the villagers found her in her garden, sitting on the bench she and Thomas had loved best, a peaceful smile on her face. They buried her beside Thomas in the small cemetery behind the village, and on their shared stone they carved not words, but an image of a rose in full bloom. The garden continued to glow after Eleanor's death, though gradually, over the years, the light began to soften and fade. It did not disappear all at once, but slowly, like a candle burning down through the night. The villagers, remembering Eleanor's devotion, took turns tending the garden, ensuring that it was never neglected. They planted new flowers each spring and pruned and weeded through the summer, passing the responsibility down through generations. And though the supernatural radiance eventually dimmed to a barely perceptible shimmer, those who walked in the garden still felt something special about the place, a sense of peace and comfort that had no logical explanation. In time, the story of the Starlight Garden became one of the cherished tales of the region, told by firesides on winter evenings and sung in gentle ballads by traveling minstrels. Some said it was a tale of magic and wonder, others called it a story of love that transcended death. But those who had known Thomas and Eleanor, who had walked in the garden when it blazed with light, knew it was simply the truth, a reminder that the best things we create in life are not made of stone or gold, but of devotion, patience, and care freely given. And far away, in places unknown to the simple folk of Greenhollow, Gandalf the Grey sometimes paused in his endless wanderings to tend a small patch of white roses that grew with unusual vigor, their petals holding a faint, inexplicable glow in the twilight hours, a living memory of a quiet garden and the enduring power of love. Story 2. In the gentle twilight of a late summer evening, when the air hung warm and heavy with the scent of ripening apples, and the last songs of thrushes echoed across the valleys of Eriador, Gandalf the Grey walked alone along the greenway. His staff tapped a steady rhythm against the ancient stones of the road, a sound that had become as familiar to the land as the whisper of wind through grass or the murmur of distant streams. The wizard moved without haste, for he had learned long ago that the most important journeys were often those taken slowly, with eyes open to the small wonders that hurried travelers might miss. The road stretched before him like a ribbon of faded silver, winding through countryside that had known peace for many long years. On either side, hedgerows thick with wild roses and honeysuckle formed living walls, their flowers glowing softly in the amber light. Bees moved drowsily from blossom to blossom, their work nearly done for the day, and somewhere in the depths of the hedge a wren sang its evening prayer. Gandalf paused to listen, his weathered face softening with appreciation. There was wisdom in the song of birds, he had always believed, for they sang without thought of tomorrow or regret for yesterday, living entirely in the golden present moment. As the sun sank lower, painting the western sky in shades of rose and gold, Gandalf came upon a sight that made him stop and lean thoughtfully upon his staff. To his left, set back from the road behind a low stone wall covered in creeping ivy, stood a cottage of such perfect charm that it might have stepped from the pages of an old tale. Its walls were built of honey-coloured stone that seemed to hold the warmth of the day even as shadows lengthened. The roof was thatched with golden straw, and smoke rose in a thin, lazy spiral from the chimney, carrying with it the homely scent of burning applewood. But it was not the cottage itself that had captured the wizard's attention. It was the garden that surrounded it, or rather, what had once been a garden. Even from the road, Gandalf could see that something had gone terribly wrong in this small paradise, where there should have been the ordered abundance of late summer, with vegetables ripening and flowers in their final glorious bloom. There was instead a scene of gentle chaos. The plants grew wild and strange, their forms twisted into shapes that nature had never intended. Tomatoes hung from vines like clusters of stars, each one glowing with a faint silver light that pulsed softly in the gathering dusk. The roses that climbed the cottage walls had blooms the size of dinner plates, and their petals seemed to shimmer with colours that had no name, hues that existed somewhere between blue and green, between violet and gold. A bean plant had grown to such enormous height that it disappeared into the evening sky, its great leaves casting shadows like the wings of sleeping birds. Carrots pushed up from the earth with tops that sparkled like emerald fountains, and the apple tree at the garden's center bore fruit that appeared to be made of crystallized moonlight. It was beautiful in its way, Gandalf thought, but it was also deeply wrong. This was not the natural magic of growing things, but something else entirely. Something that had been introduced from outside, whether by accident or design. As he stood contemplating this peculiar scene, the cottage door opened with a soft creak. An elderly woman emerged, moving slowly with the careful steps of one whose bones had grown weary with the weight of years. She wore a simple dress of faded blue, and her hair, white as fresh snow, was gathered in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. In her hands, she carried a basket, and Gandalf watched as she approached the strange garden with an expression of such profound sadness that it touched his heart. The woman stopped at the garden gate, her hand resting on the weathered wood, and simply stood there gazing at the transformed plants. She did not weep, but her shoulders sagged with a sorrow that needed no tears to be understood. Here was someone who had lost something precious, Gandalf realized, not through any grand tragedy or terrible catastrophe, but through the kind of small, quiet loss that often goes unnoticed by the wider world, yet cuts just as deep. The wizard cleared his throat gently, not wishing to startle her. The woman turned, and her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the tall figure in grey robes standing at her wall. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, the old woman and the ancient wizard, and in that moment, a kind of understanding passed between them. She saw in his face the kindness that had comforted countless souls over countless years, and he saw in hers the strength of those who endure their sorrows with quiet dignity. "Good evening," Gandalf said, his voice warm and gentle as a summer breeze. "I am but a traveller passing along the road, and I could not help but notice your remarkable garden. Forgive an old wanderer's curiosity, but I have seen many strange things in my long years, and I wonder if you might tell me the tale of how such unusual beauty came to grow here." The woman's lips trembled into something that might have been the ghost of a smile. She opened the gate with a hand that shook slightly, and gestured for him to enter. "Come in then," she said, her voice soft and weary. "Come in, and I shall tell you how my heart's greatest joy became my deepest sorrow, and how the magic that was meant to bring life has instead brought only beautiful loneliness." Gandalf followed the woman through the garden gate, his staff making soft impressions in the earth as he walked. Up close, the transformed plants were even more extraordinary than they had appeared from the road. The air itself seemed different here, charged with a gentle energy that made his skin tingle faintly, as though he walked through a place where the boundary between the waking world and the realm of dreams had grown thin. Each breath he took carried flavors that should not exist together. The sweetness of roses mingled with the earthy richness of turned soil. The sharp tang of herbs blended with something that tasted of starlight and distant music. The woman led him along a narrow path of stepping stones that wound between the luminous plants. As they walked, Gandalf noticed small details that spoke of careful tending despite the garden's wild transformation. The paths were swept clean of fallen leaves. The plants, however strange their appearance, showed no signs of disease or neglect. Someone had been caring for this magical chaos with steady devotion, even though it must have broken their heart to do so. They reached a small wooden bench beneath the apple tree, its branches heavy with those impossible fruits of crystallized moonlight. The woman settled herself upon it with a soft sigh, and Gandalf lowered himself beside her, propping his staff against the tree trunk. For a long moment, they sat in companionable silence, watching as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above. The wizard had learned that sometimes the most important conversations began not with words, but with shared quiet, a moment of peace in which two souls could find their proper rhythm. "My name is Meredith," the woman said at last, her voice barely louder than the evening breeze. "Meredith Greenleaf, though there was a time when folk simply called me Merry, for I was a cheerful soul in my younger days. This cottage and this garden have been my home for more than 60 years, since I came here as a young bride with my husband Thomas." Her eyes grew distant with memory, looking at something far beyond the garden walls. "He was a good man, Thomas, patient and kind, with hands that could coax anything to grow. Together we made this garden, planting each tree and bush with love and hope for all the years we thought we would share." Gandalf listened without interrupting, recognizing the need in her voice to tell this story, to to give shape to her sorrow through words. The evening deepened around them, and the strange plants began to glow more brightly, casting their silvery light across Meredith's lined face. "We had one child," she continued, her hands folding together in her lap. "A daughter. We named her Eleanor, and from the moment she drew her first breath, she was the light of our lives. She grew up in this garden, running between the rows of vegetables, climbing that apple tree, helping her father plant seeds each spring. She had a gift for growing things, just like Thomas, better than either of us, truth be told. Plants seemed to bloom just at her touch, and she could nurse the sickest seedling back to health with nothing more than patience and love." A small smile touched Meredith's lips, fragile as butterfly wings. She had such dreams, our Eleanor. She wanted to create the most beautiful garden in all the land, a place of such wonder that people would travel from far away just to walk among the flowers and feel the peace that growing things can bring to a troubled heart. And she had the skill to do it too. By the time she was 20, gardeners would come from neighboring villages to see what she had accomplished here. Roses that bloomed in winter, herbs with flavors so perfect they made the simplest meal taste like a feast. Vegetables so abundant we could feed ourselves, and half the village besides. The smile faded, replaced by an expression of deep pain. But Eleanor was not content with natural beauty alone. She had heard tales, you see, of ancient magics that could make plants grow in wondrous ways. She read every book she could find on the subject, travelled to distant markets to speak with hedge wizards and wandering wise folk. Thomas and I worried, but we could not deny her her dreams. She was so full of hope, so certain that she could unlock secrets that would make this garden truly magical. Meredith's voice grew softer, forcing Gandalf to lean closer to hear. 2 years ago, she met a traveller on the road, a man who claimed to be a scholar of ancient lore. He sold her a small vial of what he called star water, drawn from a pool that reflected only the light of Venus, never touched by sun or moon. He told her that one drop mixed with regular water would enhance the natural magic already present in growing things, bringing out their hidden potential. The price was steep, nearly all the silver we had saved, but Eleanor was convinced this was the key to creating the garden of her dreams. The old woman's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She mixed the star water according to the scholar's instructions, one single drop in a large watering can. She used it on her favourite plants first, the ones she had nurtured from seeds, talking to them as she watered them at sunset. And at first, it seemed her faith had been rewarded. The plants grew stronger, more vibrant. Their colours deepened, their fragrances intensified. We thought we had witnessed a miracle. But then the changes continued, Meredith whispered. They did not stop where natural beauty ended. The plants kept transforming, becoming stranger and more otherworldly with each passing day. Eleanor tried everything to halt the process. She stopped using the star water, fed the plants ordinary water, even tried to transplant them to untreated soil. Nothing worked. The magic had taken root too deeply, and it was spreading through the garden like ripples in a pond. A nightingale began to sing somewhere in the transformed hedgerow, its melody pure and sweet against the gathering darkness. Gandalf sat very still, allowing Meredith to continue her tale in her own time. He could feel the weight of what was coming, the sorrow that still lay unspoken between them like a stone in deep water. Eleanor watched her garden change with growing despair, Meredith said quietly. Each morning she would wake hoping the transformations had stopped, and each morning she would find something new and impossible growing where ordinary beauty had been before. The bean plant that now reaches to the sky was once a modest climber that gave us green beans for our table. Those roses that shimmer with impossible colours were simple pink blooms her grandmother had given us as a wedding gift. Everything she loved, everything we had built together as a family, was being remade into something strange and alien. The old woman paused, her gaze distant. But the worst of it was not the changes themselves. It was what the changes did to Eleanor's heart. She blamed herself entirely, you see. She felt she had destroyed the garden her father and I had spent a lifetime creating. She felt she had betrayed our trust, wasted our savings on a charlatan's false promise. No matter how many times Thomas and I told her we forgave her, that we understood she had acted from love and hope, she could not forgive herself. Gandalf nodded slowly, understanding. Guilt was a burden he had seen many carry over the long years. and it was often far heavier than any external punishment could be. The heart's own judgment, he had learned, was frequently the harshest court of all. She stopped sleeping well, Meredith continued. She would spend her nights out here in the garden, watching over the plants as though her vigilance might somehow reverse what had been done. She grew thin and pale, refusing to eat properly, saying she did not deserve comfort while the garden suffered. Thomas and I pleaded with her to rest, to accept that what was done and could not be undone. But she would not listen. She was determined to find a solution, to make everything right again. The woman's voice cracked slightly, and she paused to compose herself. One night, about 6 months after she first used the star water, Eleanor did not come in for supper. We found her here, beneath this very apple tree, lying as peacefully as though she had simply fallen asleep. But she was cold, so cold, and no amount of calling her name would wake her. The village healer said her heart had simply stopped, worn out by grief and exhaustion and the weight of guilt she carried. Tears slipped silently down Meredith's weathered cheeks, catching the silver light of the transformed garden. Thomas buried her in the churchyard, beneath the oldest oak tree, where the ground is always cool and peaceful. He planted forget-me-nots on her grave, the simple blue flowers she had loved as a child. And then, 3 months later, he followed her. The healer said it was fever, but I knew better. Thomas died of a broken heart, unable to live in a world without his beloved daughter. Gandalf reached out and gently placed his hand over Meredith's, saying nothing, for there were no words that could ease such loss. They sat together in silence, while the stars multiplied overhead, and the magical garden glowed softly around them. The wizard felt the familiar ache of sorrow that came from witnessing the cost of hope gone wrong, of love that had twisted into tragedy through no fault of those who loved. After a time, Meredith drew a shaky breath and continued, "So now I live here alone, tending this strange garden that killed my daughter as surely as any poison. I know what people in the village say. They think I should burn it all, salt the earth, start fresh with ordinary plants that grow in ordinary ways. But I cannot bring myself to do it. This garden, for all its strangeness, is all I have left of Eleanor and Thomas. Every impossible bloom, every glowing fruit, every plant that defies nature is a reminder of my daughter's dreams and her hope for beauty beyond the common world." She turned to look at Gandalf directly, her eyes searching his face. "But neither can I enjoy it. Each morning I wake and tend these plants because they need care, and because long habit will not let me abandon them. But there is no joy in it anymore. The garden that was meant to bring wonder to the world has become my beautiful prison, a daily reminder of everything I have lost. I am too old to start anew elsewhere, and too bound by love and memory to destroy what remains." Gandalf sat quietly, absorbing the full weight of her story. Here was a sorrow that had no easy remedy, no simple spell or word of power that could undo what had been done. Eleanor's starwater had changed the garden in ways that apparently could not be reversed, just as grief had changed Meredith in ways that time alone could not heal. Yet the wizard had not lived through countless ages without learning that even the deepest darkness could sometimes admit a small light if one knew where to look for it. "Tell me," he said gently, his voice thoughtful and kind. "Did your daughter keep records of her work? Did she write down what she planted? When she used the star water, what changes she observed?" Those who seek to create beauty through knowledge often document their efforts, their successes and failures alike. Meredith nodded slowly. She kept journals, yes, detailed accounts of everything she did in the garden. They are in the cottage still, on the shelf beside her bed. I have not had the heart to read them since she passed. They are written in her hand, you see, and seeing her words feels like hearing her voice again, which brings as much pain as comfort. Gandalf rose from the bench, leaning on his staff. "With your permission, I would like to read those journals tonight. Perhaps in Eleanor's observations there might be some clue, some pattern that could help us understand the magic she unleashed. Understanding is often the first step toward transformation, and transformation need not always mean destruction." Meredith led Gandalf into the cottage, which proved to be as tidy and welcoming as the garden was strange and otherworldly. The main room was small but comfortable, with whitewashed walls and dark wooden beams crossing the low ceiling. A fire burned gently in the stone hearth, its light dancing across simple furniture that had been polished smooth by years of use. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their familiar scents of lavender, rosemary, and thyme, mixing with the smoke to create an atmosphere of homely peace. The old woman moved to a narrow shelf beside a door that Gandalf assumed led to the bedchamber. There, arranged with careful precision, stood a row of leather-bound journals, each one identical in size and colour, their spines marked with dates written in a careful, flowing hand. Meredith's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the first volume, and Gandalf saw how even this simple act cost her something in the currency of remembered pain. "These are all of them," she said softly, gathering the journals into her arms. 7 years' worth of observations, from the time Eleanor was 17 and first began keeping detailed records until the night before she passed. She was always so methodical, so careful to write down everything she learned. Thomas used to tease her gently, saying she spent more time writing about the garden than actually working in it, but she would just laugh and say that knowledge unrecorded was knowledge lost. Gandalf accepted the journals with reverent care, cradling them as he might have held precious scrolls from some ancient library. "Thank you, Meredith. I promise to treat them with the respect they deserve. If you have a lamp I might borrow, I will sit by the fire and read through the night. There is no need for you to wait up with me. Rest, if you can. Morning will come soon enough, and perhaps with it some measure of understanding." Meredith provided him with a brass lamp filled with clear oil that burned with a steady, smokeless flame. She also brought a pot of chamomile tea and a simple supper of bread, cheese, and apples from the untransformed trees in her neighbour's orchard. Then, with a good night that carried the weight of fragile hope, she retired to her room, leaving Gandalf alone with Eleanor's legacy of words. The wizard settled himself in a comfortable chair beside the hearth, arranging the journals on a small table beside him in chronological order. He poured himself a cup of the steaming tea, breathing in its gentle, soothing aroma, and then opened the first volume. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, each entry dated and headed with notes about the weather and the phase of the moon. Here was a mind that observed the world with careful attention, seeking patterns and understanding in the grand tapestry of growing things. The early entries spoke of simple pleasures and small triumphs. Eleanor wrote about planting heirloom seeds her grandmother had saved, about coaxing a reluctant rose to bloom, about the satisfaction of harvesting vegetables she had nurtured from tiny sprouts. Her voice came through clearly in the words, enthusiastic and warm, filled with genuine love for the work of her hands. Gandalf could picture her easily, a young woman kneeling in the soil, her face lit with joy as she tended her charges. As the years progressed through the journals, Eleanor's interests began to expand beyond simple gardening. She wrote about books she had read on the theory of plant growth, about conversations with traveling herbalists, about her growing conviction that there was more to the relationship between gardener and garden than mere physical cultivation. She began to experiment with speaking to her plants, with playing music for them, with planting according to lunar cycles and ancient wisdom passed down through generations of country folk. The results she documented were modest but encouraging. Plants she spoke to kindly seemed to grow more vigorously than those she ignored. Seedlings exposed to gentle melodies produced larger yields than those grown in silence. Herbs planted when the moon was full developed stronger flavors than those planted at other times. Nothing miraculous occurred, but Eleanor's faith in the hidden magic of living things grew steadily stronger with each small success. Gandalf read on through the quiet hours, pausing occasionally to sip his tea or add another log to the fire. The cottage was deeply peaceful, insulated from the outside world by thick stone walls and the gentle sounds of settling timbers. Outside, the transformed garden glowed softly in the darkness, its strange beauty keeping watch over the home it had both blessed and cursed. In the 5th journal, dated to 2 years before Eleanor's death, the tone of the entries began to change. Eleanor wrote about her frustration with the limits of natural growth, her longing to create something truly extraordinary, something that would astonish and delight all who saw it. She mentioned meeting various travelers and collectors, hearing tales of magical gardens in distant lands where flowers bloomed in impossible colors and fruits granted visions of beauty beyond mortal understanding. Then came the entry Gandalf had been seeking, dated to a warm day in late spring. Eleanor described meeting the scholar on the road, a man who called himself Asterion, and claimed to have travelled from the far south, from lands where ancient magic still flowed freely in the world. She wrote about his offer of the star water with barely contained excitement, listing all the wonders he promised it would bring. Her hope leaped from the page like a living thing, pure and bright and utterly trusting. But it was the entry that came 3 days later that made Gandalf lean forward with sudden attention, his eyes narrowing as he read the careful description Eleanor had written. She documented exactly how she had prepared the star water for use, and the wizard noticed something the desperate, guilt-stricken Eleanor had apparently missed in her later attempts to undo the damage. The instructions Asterion had given her were incomplete, stopping at the point where the magic was activated, but never explaining how to control or conclude the transformation. Gandalf sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against the arm. This was either the work of a careless fool who did not fully understand the magic he sold, or something far more troubling, the deliberate act of someone who knew exactly what would happen and simply did not care. Either way, Eleanor had been the victim of knowledge given without wisdom, power offered without responsibility. He read on through the remaining journals, watching as Eleanor's joy turned to confusion, then to fear, and finally to the crushing guilt that had ultimately claimed her life. The fire had burned low to glowing embers by the time Gandalf closed the final journal and set it gently atop the others. The night was deep and still around him, that quiet hour before dawn when the world seems to hold its breath between darkness and light. Through the cottage window, he could see the transformed garden glowing softly, its ethereal luminescence painting the darkness with strokes of silver and blue, and that strange nameless color that existed only in places where magic had seeped too deeply into the fabric of the world. The wizard rose from his chair, his joints protesting slightly after the long hours of sitting, and moved to the window. He stood there, gazing out at Eleanor's legacy, his mind turning over everything he had read. The journals had revealed a pattern, subtle but unmistakable to eyes trained by centuries of observing the workings of magic in all its forms. The star water had not simply enchanted the plants in some random chaotic fashion. Rather, it had awakened something that already existed within them, a dormant potential that all living things carried but rarely expressed. Every seed that falls to earth, Gandalf murmured to himself, carries within it not just one future, but many possibilities. The oak tree holds in its acorn 1,000 different shapes it might take, depending on the soil, the weather, the care it receives or lacks. What Eleanor's star water did was remove the boundaries that usually constrain growth, allowing each plant to reach for its most impossible potential all at once. He could see the truth of it in the garden before him. The bean plant that reached toward the stars was expressing the upward yearning that all climbing plants possessed, but without the natural limits of strength and structure that normally prevented such impossible height. The roses, with their shimmering, nameless colors, were showing all the hues they might have developed across generations of careful breeding, but compressed into a single moment of transformation. Even the tomatoes that glowed like captured stars were simply manifesting the light and warmth they drew from the sun, made visible and eternal. It was beautiful in its way, Gandalf thought, but it was also deeply unbalanced. Nature in its wisdom had established boundaries for good reason. A plant that grew without limits would exhaust itself, and the soil that nourished it. Colors that existed outside the normal spectrum might be lovely to behold, but they spoke of energies that did not properly belong in the waking world. The garden had become a place caught between what was and what might be, unable to settle into either state. The wizard turned from the window and quietly let himself out of the cottage, closing the door with barely a whisper of sound. He wanted to walk among the transformed plants, to feel their magic more directly, to understand what they had become in the 2 years since Eleanor first watered them with starlit possibility. The night air was cool and fresh against his face, carrying scents that shifted and changed with each breath. Now honey and roses, now rain in distant mountains, now something that smelled of starlight and dreams. As he walked the garden paths, Gandalf extended his senses carefully, feeling for the currents of magic that flowed through the plants like sap through their stems. What he discovered both troubled and intrigued him. The magic was not fading with time, as he had half hoped. Instead, it had reached a kind of equilibrium, a strange balance where the plants existed in a state of perpetual transformation. They were neither growing nor dying, neither fully of this world nor entirely removed from it. They were suspended, caught in an eternal moment of becoming. He paused beside the great bean plant and laid his hand gently against its trunk, which was now thick as an old oak tree. Through his palm he could feel the plant's confusion, its desperate reaching towards something it could never quite grasp. It wanted to grow, to climb, to reach the sun. But the sun it sought was not the ordinary star that warmed the Middle-earth. It was reaching for the light beyond light, the fire at the heart of creation itself. And of course, it could never arrive at such a destination. "Poor thing," Gandalf said softly. "You are trying to become something you were never meant to be, and yet you cannot stop trying, because the magic will not let you rest." He moved on to the roses, those impossible blooms that shimmered with colors drawn from dreams. When he touched their petals, they felt like silk and shadow, like morning mist and distant music. They too were caught in their transformation, trying to express beauty beyond the capacity of mortal flowers to contain. If he listened very carefully, he could almost hear them singing. A chorus of tiny voices, each trying to produce a note that existed just beyond the range of hearing. The apple tree with its moonlight fruit drew him next. Here the magic was perhaps strongest of all, for fruit represents both culmination and promise, the end of one cycle and the potential beginning of another. These apples would never fall, never rot, never give their seeds back to the earth to begin the cycle anew. They were perfect and eternal and utterly sterile, beautiful things that could create nothing beyond their own crystallized beauty. Gandalf stood beneath the tree's branches, his head tilted back, studying the impossible fruit. Slowly, understanding began to dawn in his ancient mind. Eleanor had tried to reverse the magic by stopping the use of the star water, by feeding the plants ordinary water, by transplanting them to untreated soil. But these approaches had all focused on removing the source of the magic, when what was needed was something quite different. The magic had to be completed, not reversed. The plants had to be allowed to finish their transformation, to reach whatever destination the star water had set them seeking. But how could he help them complete a journey toward the impossible? How could finite earthly plants reach for infinite, celestial perfection? The answer, when it came to him, was so simple he almost laughed aloud. They could not reach their destination because their destination did not exist in the world as it was. Therefore, the destination would have to be created for them, a place where their transformed nature could find rest and purpose. The wizard smiled, a plan beginning to form in his thoughts, like the first light of dawn touching a darkened sky. Dawn was breaking over the eastern hills when Gandalf returned to the cottage, the sky blushing pink and gold with the promise of a clear summer day. He found Meredith already awake, sitting at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling between her hands. She looked as though she had slept little, if at all, and her eyes searched his face anxiously as he entered, seeking some sign of hope or hopelessness in his expression. The wizard settled himself across from her, accepting the cup of tea she poured for him without being asked. For a long moment he simply sat there, warming his hands on the earthenware, gathering his thoughts into the right words. What he needed to explain was not simple, and he wanted to be certain Meredith understood both what he proposed and what it would mean for her and her transformed garden. "I have read all of Eleanor's journals," he began gently, "and I believe I understand what happened here. Your daughter was given a magic that awakens potential, that allows living things to reach toward their most perfect form, but she was not given the knowledge of how to guide that reaching, how to provide a destination for the transformation she initiated. The plants have been trying to complete a journey for which no ending was ever prepared." Meredith nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. That is why nothing she tried could reverse the changes. She was trying to stop a process that was already incomplete, like attempting to unspeak words already spoken or unsee sights already witnessed. "Exactly so," Gandalf said, a note of approval in his voice. "You have wisdom, Meredith Greenleaf, even in your sorrow. And that wisdom is what makes me hopeful that you might accept the solution I wish to propose, even though it will require you to make a choice that may not be easy." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes kind but serious. "The plants cannot return to what they were. That road is closed to them forever. But they can be helped to complete their transformation, to find a place where their impossible beauty serves a purpose and brings joy rather than pain. What they need is not to be in the ordinary world, but in a place between the ordinary and the extraordinary. A threshold space where magic is natural and transformations are welcomed rather than feared." "What kind of place could that be?" Meredith asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. Gandalf smiled. "There is, in the lands west of the Shire, a garden that has existed since the Elder Days. It is tended by those who understand the speech of growing things, who can nurture plants that exist in the borderlands between the mortal world and the realm of deeper magics. The elves of Rivendell maintain this garden as a place of healing and wonder, where wounded things may find peace and transformed things may find purpose. I believe your garden, or rather Eleanor's garden, would be welcomed there. The plants could complete their transformation in soil that understands their nature, under the care of gardeners who would appreciate their impossible beauty. Meredith was quiet for a long time, looking down into her tea, as though seeking visions in its amber depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You are asking me to give up the last pieces of my daughter and my husband, to send away the only things I have left that they touched and loved." "No," Gandalf said firmly but gently. "I am asking you to give them the gift of completion, to allow them to become what Eleanor dreamed they might be. And I am offering you a choice, Meredith. You need not remain here alone, tending to memories that bring you pain. The elves would welcome you as well, if you wish to come. You could live in Rivendell and tend your daughter's garden there, seeing it thrive and bring joy to others, as she always hoped it would. Or you could remain here, in this cottage that has been your home for so many years, and I would ensure that cuttings and seeds were sent back to you, ordinary descendants of the transformed plants that you could nurture in the old way." The old woman's hands trembled, tea sloshing slightly in her cup. "A third path also exists," Gandalf continued quietly. "If you cannot bear to part with the garden entirely, we could attempt something different. I could work a magic of my own, not to reverse Eleanor's changes, but to gentle them, to bring the plants back from the edge of impossibility to something closer to the world they grew from. They would remain unusual, touched by magic, but they would no longer glow with starlight or reach for unreachable skies. They would be strange and beautiful, but they would also be possible. Which path would you choose?" Meredith asked, looking up at him with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "I would choose completion," the wizard said without hesitation. "I would want Eleanor's dream to find its fullest expression, even if that meant letting go of my hold upon it. But I am not you, Meredith, and I have not walked the path you have walked. The choice must be yours, and whatever you decide, I will support it with all the power and wisdom I possess." Meredith rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the garden that glowed softly, even in the strengthening daylight. Gandalf remained where he was, giving her the space and silence she needed to feel her way toward her decision. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the windowsill, as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had become uncertain. Outside, a thrush began to sing from the transformed hedge, its voice pure and clear. The sound seemed to reach something deep within Meredith, for her shoulders relaxed slightly and her grip on the windowsill loosened. She turned back to Gandalf, and he saw that tears were streaming down her face, but her expression held something that had been absent before. Not quite peace, perhaps, but the beginning of acceptance. "Tell me more about this garden in Rivendell," she said quietly. "Tell me what it is like there, and what would become of Eleanor's plants if they were to find their home in such a place." Gandalf gestured for Meredith to sit once more, and when she had settled herself back at the table, he began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of memory and deep affection. His words painted pictures in the air between them, images of a place that existed beyond the ordinary bounds of the world she knew. "Rivendell is called Imladris in the Elvish tongue," he said softly, "and it means deep valley of the cleft. It lies hidden in the western lands, cradled between mountains that stand like ancient guardians keeping watch over all who dwell there. To reach it, one must follow paths that wind through pine forests, where the air is sharp and clean, where streams sing songs that have no ending, where the very stones remember the music that shaped the world in its first making." He paused, allowing her to absorb this image before continuing. "The last homely house stands at the heart of the valley, a place of such peace that merely to approach it is to feel the burdens of the world growing lighter with each step. Master Elrond has kept that house for more than 3,000 years, offering sanctuary to all who come there with good intent. I have visited many times over the long centuries, and each time I arrive, I feel as though I am returning home after a long journey through lands less kind and less fair." Meredith listened intently, her earlier tears drying on her cheeks as Gandalf's words transported her beyond her sorrow. "Tell me about the gardens," she said. "What grows there? Who tends them? The wizard's eyes grew distant with remembrance. The gardens of Rivendell are unlike any others in Middle-earth, for they are tended by those who remember when the world was young, and all growing things spoke openly to those who had ears to hear. There are trees there that were saplings when the mountains were new, flowers that bloom in colours borrowed from sunset and starlight, herbs that carry healing in their very fragrance. But more than their age or their beauty, what makes these gardens special is the love with which they are tended. He leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on the rhythm of one telling a tale meant to soothe and comfort. The elves who care for them understand that every plant is a living song, a melody of growth and change that plays out over seasons and years. They do not seek to control or limit what grows there, but rather to listen to what each plant wishes to become and help it along that path. They speak to the roses, and the roses answer. They sing to the ancient trees, and the trees sing back. It is a conversation that has continued unbroken since the first seeds were planted in that blessed soil. And they would welcome plants like mine? Meredith asked. Plants that have been changed by magic, that glow with impossible light and reach for unreachable stars. Gandalf nodded firmly. They would not merely welcome them, Meredith. They would treasure them. You see, the elves understand transformation in ways that we shorter-lived folk often cannot. They have watched acorns become mighty oaks, seen seedlings grow into ancient forests, witnessed the endless dance of seasons turning the same garden into 1,000 different versions of itself. They know that change is not corruption, but the very nature of life itself. He reached across the table and took her hand gently in his. Your daughter's plants, transformed as they are, would be seen not as mistakes or tragedies, but as rare gifts. Think of it, Meredith. That bean plant that reaches toward the sky would have room to climb in Rivendell's gardens, supported by ancient arbors and guided by hands that understand its yearning. Those roses with their nameless colors would bloom beside other flowers touched by magic, their impossible hues harmonizing with shades drawn from sunset and starlight. The apple tree with its moonlight fruit would stand in an orchard where even stranger fruits grow, each one tended with patience and love. Meredith's expression had softened as he spoke, the lines of pain around her eyes easing slightly. And what would become of them there? Would they continue to change, or would they find some kind of peace? That, Gandalf said thoughtfully, would depend on the plants themselves, and on what they need to complete their transformation. The elves would observe them carefully, learning their nature, discovering what they seek. Some might indeed continue to change, but the changes would be guided rather than wild, purposeful rather than random. Others might settle into a new form of stability, having found the destination Eleanor's starwater set them seeking. But all of them would be valued and cared for, not as curiosities, but as honored guests who have traveled far to find their true home. He paused, allowing his words to settle in her heart, before adding, "And there is something else you should know. In Rivendell, memory is preserved with great care and deep respect. If you were to send Eleanor's garden there, it would not be forgotten. The elves would learn its history, understand the love that created it, and the sorrow it has caused. Your daughter's name would be remembered in their songs, her dream honored in the continuing life of the plants she transformed. She would become part of the long story of that place, woven into its tapestry of memory, alongside countless others who have contributed to its beauty and wisdom." Meredith was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still resting in Gandalf's gentle grip. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, its ordinary golden light mingling with the strange silver glow of the transformed garden. The contrast between the two kinds of light seemed to illustrate the choice before her, the ordinary world she had always known, and the magical realm to which she might send Eleanor's legacy. "What of me?" she asked finally, her voice small and uncertain. "You said I could go there too, if I wished. But I am old, Gandalf, and set in my ways. I am not like these plants that can be transplanted and take root in new soil. I have lived in this cottage for 60 years. Every stone and timber knows my touch. Every path in the garden holds memories of Thomas and Eleanor walking beside me. Could I truly leave all that behind?" Gandalf squeezed her hand gently. "You could, if you chose to, but choosing not to would be equally valid. There is no shame in knowing one's own limits, in recognizing that some roots grow too deep to be safely moved. The question is not whether you could leave, but whether staying would bring you peace, or simply prolong your sorrow." Meredith withdrew her hand gently, and rose from the table once more. But this time, she moved with purpose rather than uncertainty. She walked to a small wooden chest that sat beneath the window and opened it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. From within, she drew out a folded cloth, and when she spread it on the table before Gandalf, he saw that it was a sampler, the kind that young women stitched to practice their needlework and record something of meaning to their lives. Eleanor made this when she was 12, Meredith said softly, running her fingers over the faded threads. She was never particularly skilled with a needle, much preferring dirt under her fingernails to thread between her fingers, but she persisted until she had finished it. Look at what she chose to stitch. Gandalf leaned forward to examine the sampler more closely. In the center, worked in threads of green and gold and brown, was a garden. Not a formal garden with neat rows and geometric beds, but a wild, joyful tangle of plants growing together in happy profusion. Flowers bloomed beside vegetables, fruit trees spread their branches over herbs, and climbing vines wound their way through everything. At the bottom, in slightly crooked letters, Eleanor had stitched the words, "A garden is a promise to tomorrow." The wizard traced the words with one long finger, understanding flooding through him. "Your daughter believed in the future," he said quietly. Even as a child, she understood that a garden is not built for today alone, but for all the days to come. Every seed planted is an act of faith that there will be a tomorrow to see it bloom. Meredith nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She always looked forward, my Eleanor, even in her darkest moments, when the guilt was crushing her and she could barely sleep for grief. She still tended the transformed garden. She still watered and weeded and cared for the plants as though they might yet have a future. I think she died not from a broken heart, but from exhaustion, from pouring all her hope into tomorrow when she had none left for today. She folded the sampler carefully and held it against her chest like something precious. I have been living backwards since she passed, Gandalf. I tend the garden because it is what was, not what might be. I keep her room exactly as she left it because I cannot bear to imagine a future without her in it. I sit in this cottage and wait for time to carry me to wherever Thomas and Eleanor have gone, because I cannot see a path forward that does not include them. But Eleanor would want you to look forward, Gandalf said gently. She would want her garden to have a future, even if she could not be here to see it, and she would want the same for you. Meredith returned to her seat, setting the sampler on the table between them. I know, she whispered. In my heart, I have always known, but knowing and doing are different things, and the distance between them can feel wider than all the leagues between here and your Rivendell. Then let us make the distance smaller, Gandalf suggested. Let us take this one step at a time, one choice at a time, until the journey no longer seems impossible. First, tell me this. If you could be certain that Eleanor's garden would thrive in Rivendell, that it would bring joy and wonder to others as she always dreamed, would you be willing to let it go? Meredith considered the question carefully, her hands folded around the sampler. At length, she nodded. Yes, she said. If I knew the plants would be happy there, if I knew they would be valued and tended with love, I could let them go. Keeping them here serves only my need to hold on to the past, not their need to complete what Eleanor began. Good, Gandalf said warmly. That is the first step, and often the hardest. Now the second question. If the garden were to go to Rivendell, would you wish to accompany it yourself, or would you prefer to remain here and receive word of how it fares in its new home? The old woman was quiet for a long time, staring down at the garden stitched by her daughter's young hands so many years ago. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been. I think I would like to see it settled there, she said slowly. I would like to meet these elves who would care for Eleanor's dream and tell them her story myself, but I do not think I could stay in Rivendell permanently. My roots are here, Gandalf, in this cottage and this land. Thomas is buried in the churchyard down the road, and Eleanor beside him. When my own time comes, I wish to lie there with them, in the soil that knew us all. Then that is what shall be, Gandalf said with a smile. You will journey with me to Rivendell, see the garden planted in its new home, spend as much time there as you wish to ensure the plants are thriving, and then I will bring you back here when you are ready. And I promise you this, Meredith Greenleaf. I will ensure that cuttings and seeds are sent back to you, untouched by the Starwater's magic, so that you may tend ordinary descendants of Eleanor's extraordinary garden for the rest of your days. Meredith's face, which had been tight with grief and uncertainty, began to relax. The decision, once made, seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders. "When would we leave?" she asked. "How long would such a journey take?" "We would need several days to prepare," Gandalf replied. "The plants must be carefully dug up and prepared for travel. I will need to gather certain materials and speak certain words to ensure they survive the journey unharmed. And you will need time to put your affairs in order, to speak to your neighbours, to ready yourself for what will be a considerable adventure for someone who has not travelled far from home in many years." He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the transformed garden with an appraising eye. "But it can be done, and done well, if we approach it with patience and care. I estimate we could be ready to depart within a fortnight, and the journey itself would take perhaps 3 weeks, travelling at a pace comfortable for you and safe for the plants." The fortnight that followed was a time of gentle industry and quiet transformation. Gandalf remained at the cottage, sleeping in the small guest room that Meredith prepared for him, and each day he worked in the garden with a patience that seemed to slow time itself. He spoke to each plant before touching it, explaining in soft words what was to come, asking permission to move it from the soil it had known to earth that would better understand its transformed nature. Meredith watched from the cottage window as the wizard moved among the glowing plants, his hands careful and reverent. She saw how he listened to silence, his head tilted as though hearing voices carried on the wind. Sometimes he would nod as if in agreement with something the plants had told him. Other times he would murmur words in languages she did not recognize, ancient tongues that seemed to make the very air shimmer with power. The preparation was done in stages, for Gandalf insisted that rushing would harm the plants more than help them. First, he walked the garden's boundaries, placing smooth riverstones at intervals, and speaking words of protection over each one. "These will keep the magic contained during the transition," he explained to Meredith. "Think of them as gentle hands holding everything safe until we reach Rivendell." Next came the careful digging. Gandalf used no ordinary spade, but worked with his hands, and with wood specially prepared, carved from fallen branches of oak and ash that he found in the nearby forest. He dug deep around each plant, taking generous amounts of soil with every root ball, wrapping everything in cloth that he had blessed with dew collected from spider webs at dawn. Meredith helped as she was able, though Gandalf insisted she do no heavy lifting. Instead, she prepared supplies for the journey, baking travel bread that would keep fresh for weeks, drying fruits and herbs, mending the wizard's grey cloak where it had grown threadbare at the hem. She also spent time in the garden, simply sitting with the plants, saying her farewells to them one by one. She sat longest beneath the apple tree where Eleanor had died, her hands resting on its trunk, feeling the strange, cool warmth of its moonlight bark. "I am sending you somewhere beautiful," she whispered to it. "Somewhere you can finish becoming whatever you were meant to be. Eleanor would be glad, I think. She always wanted her garden to bring joy to others." The night before their departure, Gandalf performed one final working. He built a small fire in the centre of the garden, and when it had burned down to glowing coals, he scattered upon them dried leaves from every plant that was to make the journey. As they burned, releasing fragrant smoke that spiraled up toward the stars, he sang. The song was in no language Meredith knew, but she felt its meaning in her bones. It was a song of journeying, of leaving and arriving, of endings that were also beginnings. When the last notes faded and the smoke had cleared, the garden seemed different somehow. The plants still glowed, still reached toward impossible heights, and displayed their otherworldly colours, but there was a new quality to their light. It seemed less frantic, more peaceful, as though they understood what was coming and were ready for it. They departed at dawn, leading a cart pulled by a sturdy pony that Gandalf had acquired from a nearby farm. The transformed plants filled the cart bed, their roots wrapped and secured, their leaves and branches covered with cloth to shield them from the road dust. Meredith took a last look at her cottage, at the empty garden plot where so much love and sorrow had been invested over the years, and then she turned her face westward without looking back. The journey was long, but not unpleasant. Gandalf set an easy pace, stopping often to check on the plants and to allow Meredith to rest. They travelled through countryside that grew wilder and more beautiful with each passing day, leaving behind the tamed lands of farms and villages for regions where nature held fuller sway. The wizard proved to be excellent company, full of stories that he told in the evenings as they camped beneath the stars. He spoke of the elder days when the world was young, of great deeds and noble hearts, of sorrows long past and joys that endured through all the ages. Meredith found herself drawn out of her grief by these tales, her imagination kindled by visions of times and places far beyond her small experience. She began to understand that her sorrow, while real and deep, was but one note in a much greater song that had been playing since before the mountains rose. As they travelled, Meredith noticed that Gandalf seemed to grow younger, or perhaps it was simply that he grew more himself. His step became lighter, his eyes brighter, and he smiled more readily. She realized that he was going home in his own way, returning to a place where he was known and loved, where his true nature could express itself more freely than it did in the lands of men and hobbits. After 3 weeks of steady travel, they came at last to a high pass between mountains. Gandalf stopped the pony and gestured ahead. "Look," he said simply, and Meredith followed his gaze. Below them, cradled between peaks that caught the sunset light on their snowy crowns, lay a valley of such surpassing beauty that Meredith felt tears spring to her eyes. Green meadows bordered a river that sang even at this distance. Trees of impossible age spread their branches in gestures of welcome, and nestled at the valley's heart was a house that seemed to have grown from the living rock, its many terraces and gardens flowing like water down the hillside. "That is Rivendell," Gandalf said softly, "the last homely house. And there, Meredith Greenleaf, your daughter's dream will find its completion." They descended into the valley as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades that rivaled even the transformed roses for beauty. The path wound down through pine forests where the air was sweet and clean, where streams crossed their way in silver ribbons, where birds sang songs of welcome to the travellers. And with each step downward, Meredith felt something in her chest begin to ease, a tightness she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. By the time they reached the courtyard before the last homely house, stars had begun to appear overhead, and lamps were being lit in the windows. Tall figures in flowing robes emerged to greet them, and Meredith saw that Gandalf had not exaggerated their grace or their kindness. The elves of Rivendell received Eleanor's garden with a reverence that moved Meredith to tears. Lord Elrond himself came to examine the transformed plants, his ageless face alight with wonder and compassion as Gandalf explained their history. He listened to Meredith's halting account of her daughter's dreams and the tragedy that had followed, and when she had finished, he took her weathered hands in his own smooth ones. "Your daughter sought to touch the stars," he said gently, his voice like music on water. "There is no shame in such reaching, only courage. We will honor her dream by giving these plants the home they need to complete their journey. They will be tended with love and understanding, and her name will be remembered in our songs for as long as memory endures in this valley." A place had been prepared in the garden, a section that bordered both cultivated beds and wild woodland, a threshold space where magic and nature intermingled freely. The elves worked through the night by lamplight and starlight, planting each transformed specimen with infinite care. They sang as they worked, old songs of growing things and patient time, of roots finding home in welcoming earth. Meredith watched from a bench nearby, wrapped in a warm cloak against the cool night air. Gandalf sat beside her, smoking his pipe in companionable silence. As dawn approached, the final plant was settled into its new home, and the elven gardeners stepped back to observe their work. What happened next was something Meredith would remember for the rest of her days. As the first light of morning touched the valley, the transformed plants seemed to sigh with relief. Their frantic glowing dimmed to a softer luminescence. Their reaching toward impossible heights gentled into graceful curves. The bean plants that had strained toward distant stars now climbed contentedly up a silver trellis the elves had prepared. The roses with nameless colours settled into hues that, while still extraordinary, no longer hurt the eyes to behold. Even the apple tree's crystalline fruit seemed to soften, becoming something that existed peacefully between moon and earth. "They have found what they were seeking," Elrond said softly. "Not perfection, but acceptance. Not completion, but belonging. Sometimes that is all any of us truly need." Meredith spent a month in Rivendell, visiting the garden each day and watching as the plants continued their gentle transformation into something both magical and at peace. The elves welcomed her warmly, and she found herself drawn into the rhythms of the valley, the timeless quality of days that flowed like water from one into the next without hurry or strain. She learned the names of the elven gardeners who would tend Eleanor's plants, and she told each of them stories about her daughter. She described Eleanor as a child, covered in dirt and laughing. Eleanor as a young woman, full of dreams and determination. Eleanor in her final days, burdened by guilt but still faithful to her vision. The elves listened to every word, weaving the stories into their understanding of the garden they now tended. On the evening before her departure, Meredith walked through the garden one last time. The transformed plants glowed softly in the twilight, their light now warm and welcoming rather than frantic and otherworldly. She stopped before each one, whispering her gratitude and her farewell. When she reached the apple tree, she placed her hand against its trunk and felt the gentle pulse of contentment within it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me see you happy. Eleanor would be so glad." True to his word, Gandalf had prepared a package for her to take home. It contained seeds from the plants before their transformation, cuttings that carried no trace of Starwater magic, only the natural beauty that Thomas and Eleanor had cultivated over the years. "These you can plant in your garden at home," he said, as he handed them to her. "They will grow in ordinary ways, but they will still be descended from Eleanor's dream, still carry something of what she hoped to create." The journey back was shorter than the journey out, or perhaps it only seemed so because Meredith travelled with a lighter heart. When they reached her cottage at last, she found that neighbours had kept watch over it in her absence, keeping the weeds down and the windows clean. The garden plot stood empty and waiting, ready for new beginnings. Gandalf stayed only long enough to help her plant the first of the seeds and cuttings, blessing the soil and speaking words of encouragement over the tiny green shoots that would grow there. Then, with a warm farewell and a promise to visit when his wanderings brought him near, he departed once more on his eternal rounds. Meredith stood at her gate and watched him go. This strange wizard who had appeared at her darkest hour and shown her a path forward she could not have imagined on her own. When he had disappeared from sight down the road, she turned back to her cottage and her garden with a sense of peace she had not felt in years. The seasons turned as seasons do. The seeds Gandalf had given her sprouted and grew, becoming strong, healthy plants that bore ordinary flowers and fruits touched by nothing more mysterious than sunlight and rain. Meredith tended them with the same love she had always brought to her gardening, but now, without the weight of sorrow that had made every task a burden. She lived simply and contentedly for many more years, and when travellers passed by her cottage, they would often stop to admire the beautiful garden that grew there. Some said the flowers seemed to bloom a bit brighter than ordinary flowers, the fruits to taste a bit sweeter, but this was likely just the effect of the loving care they received. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars shone bright and the air was soft with summer warmth, Meredith would sit in her garden and think of another garden far to the west, where transformed plants grew in a hidden valley, and elves sang songs that remembered her daughter's name. She would smile then, a smile of peace and acceptance, knowing that Eleanor's dream had found its home and her restless spirit could finally rest. The garden, both here and there, had kept its promise. It had reached toward tomorrow and found it waiting, ready to bloom. Story 3. In the late autumn of the Third Age, when the leaves had turned to copper and gold, and the first whispers of winter touched the northern lands, Gandalf the Grey walked the old road that wound through the foothills of the Misty Mountains. His staff tapped a gentle rhythm against the worn stones, and his grey cloak billowed softly in the cool breeze that carried the scent of distant snow and aging pine. The wizard had been travelling for many weeks, moving from village to village as was his custom, bringing news from far lands and counsel to those who sought it. Yet on this particular journey, his steps were guided by something more than wanderlust or duty. A troubling rumour had reached his ears in Rivendell, carried by a weary merchant who had passed through the remote hamlet of Thornley, nestled in a hidden valley beneath the mountain's shadow. The merchant had spoken of sleepless nights and troubled minds, of an entire community gripped by unrest that seemed to seep into their very bones. At first, Gandalf had thought little of it. Autumn often brought melancholy to isolated places, and the approach of winter could weigh heavily on simple folk. But the merchant's description had given him pause. The people of Thornley, he said, had ceased to dream. Or rather, when they did dream, they found themselves walking through grey mists where no rest could be found, returning to waking with more weariness than when they had lain down to sleep. Children cried through the night. The elderly grew frailer by the day. Even the strongest among them moved through their daily tasks, as though wading through deep water, their eyes shadowed and their spirits dimmed. Such a thing was unnatural, Gandalf knew. Dreams were a gift, a necessary respite for mortal minds. Without them, even the heartiest soul would eventually crumble. Something was amiss in Thornley, and though it might prove to be nothing more than a passing malady, the wizard's long experience told him to investigate. There were old powers in Middle-earth, remnants of darker ages, and sometimes they stirred in unexpected places. If something was stealing the dreams of an entire village, it needed to be understood and, if possible, remedied. The road to Thornley was not well travelled. As Gandalf left the main path and turned onto a narrow track that climbed steadily upward, he noticed how the forest seemed to grow quieter. The usual chatter of birds diminished to occasional hesitant notes. Even the wind moved differently here, as though uncertain of its course. The trees, ancient oaks and ash, stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching overhead to form a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into patterns of gold and shadow. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground in layers of russet and brown, muffling his footsteps until it seemed he walked through a world wrapped in wool. As the day lengthened and the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Gandalf crested a final rise and saw the valley of Thornley spread before him. It was a small place, perhaps 30 cottages clustered around a central green where a well stood beneath an old rowan tree. Smoke rose from some of the chimneys, thin grey threads that barely disturbed the still air. Fields, now harvested and lying fallow, surrounded the village in neat patterns. A small stream, swollen with autumn rains, wound through the valley floor, its waters catching the fading light like liquid amber. Under different circumstances, it would have seemed peaceful, even idyllic. But Gandalf's keen eyes noticed the absence of normal village sounds. No children played on the green. No one worked in the gardens. The few figures he could see moved slowly, almost reluctantly, about their tasks. As he descended into the valley, following the track that led directly to the village green, Gandalf became aware of something else. The air itself seemed heavier here, thick with an invisible weight that pressed gently but insistently against his awareness. It was not malevolent, not precisely, but it was definitely wrong. The natural flow of things had been disrupted. He could feel it in the way the light seemed slightly dimmer than it should be, in the way sounds seemed muted and distant, even when their sources were near. Most telling of all was the quality of exhaustion that hung over everything like a veil. Even the trees seemed weary, their branches drooping more than autumn alone could account for. A woman emerged from one of the cottages as Gandalf entered the village proper. She was perhaps 40 years of age, though weariness made her seem older. Her hair, once probably a rich brown, was streaked with premature grey, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She watched the wizard's approach with a mixture of hope and apprehension, as one might regard a physician whose arrival confirms the seriousness of an illness. Gandalf offered her a gentle smile and raised his hand in greeting. The woman hesitated, then stepped forward, her movements careful and deliberate as though she feared spending more energy than absolutely necessary. The wizard introduced himself quietly, his voice warm and reassuring. He explained that he had heard of their troubles and had come to offer what help he might. The woman's eyes filled with tears of relief, though she blinked them back quickly. Her name was Mara, she told him, and she served as the village healer, though her skills seemed useless against this particular affliction. She invited him to the village hall, a modest building of stone and timber that stood near the rowan tree, where the elders could speak with him. As they walked the short distance, Gandalf noticed how even this simple act seemed to cost her greatly, and his concern deepened. The village hall was a simple but well-built structure, its stone walls thick enough to keep out winter's chill, and its hearth large enough to warm the entire space. Yet, as Gandalf entered, following Mara through the heavy wooden door, he felt none of the comfort such a place should offer. The fire that burned in the hearth seemed dim despite its size, and the warmth it provided felt distant, as though it could not quite reach into the corners of the room, or penetrate the bone-deep weariness that hung over everything. Several villagers had already gathered, seated on benches arranged in a rough semicircle. They looked up at the wizard's entrance with expressions that mingled hope and desperation in equal measure. Gandalf counted perhaps a dozen souls present, ranging from a young man who could not have seen more than 20 summers to an ancient woman whose white hair was gathered in a long braid down her back. All bore the same signs of profound exhaustion. Their eyes were hollow, rimmed with darkness, that spoke of many sleepless nights. Their movements were slow and careful, as though each gesture required thought and effort. Even their voices, when they greeted him, were hushed and threadbare, lacking the vitality that should have animated them. The wizard settled himself on a bench near the fire, laying his staff across his knees, and regarded them with compassion and concern. The eldest among them, a man named Torald, who served as the village headman, began to speak. His voice was rough with weariness, but he chose his words carefully, describing how the affliction had begun nearly 3 weeks past. At first, it had seemed nothing more than a few restless nights. Several villagers had mentioned troubled sleep, dreams that felt more like wandering through fog than proper rest. But within days, the condition had spread throughout Thornley until not a single soul could claim a peaceful night's slumber. They would lie down exhausted and fall almost immediately into sleep. But the sleep that came brought no restoration. Instead, they found themselves in a grey place, a realm of mist and shadow where they walked endlessly without purpose or destination, always seeking something they could not name, never finding rest. A younger woman, her infant son drowsing fitfully in her arms, added her voice to the tale. The children suffered worst of all, she said. They would cry out in the night, describing dreams of being lost in fog, of searching for their homes and families but finding only empty greyness. The babies could not speak of their torment, but their constant fretfulness and weak cries told their own story. Even nursing had become difficult, for the mothers were so drained that their milk came thin and sparse. The woman's voice broke as she spoke, and tears tracked down her pale cheeks. Gandalf reached out and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. Others spoke in turn, each adding their experience to the growing picture. The blacksmith described how his strength had abandoned him, how work that should have taken an hour now consumed half a day. The baker told of bread that refused to rise properly, as though even the yeast shared the village's exhaustion. A farmer spoke of livestock that seemed listless and troubled, cows that gave less milk and chickens that laid fewer eggs. It was as though the affliction extended beyond the human inhabitants to touch everything living in the valley. The very land itself seemed to be sickening, drained of some essential vitality. As Gandalf listened, his mind worked to piece together the nature of this malady. It was no natural illness, that much was certain, nor was it the work of obvious dark forces. There was no sense of malevolence here, no signature of deliberate cruelty. Instead, he sensed something more subtle, a disruption in the natural order of things. Dreams were more than mere idle fancies of the sleeping mind. They were pathways, connections to deeper realms where the spirit could rest and renew itself. If those pathways had been blocked or corrupted, the results would be exactly what he now witnessed. But what could cause such a thing? And more importantly, why here, in this small and unremarkable valley? When the villagers had finished their accounts, Gandalf sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers stroking his long beard as he contemplated what he had heard. The fire crackled softly beside him, and outside the hall, the afternoon had faded into early evening. The light that filtered through the windows had taken on the golden quality of sunset, though it seemed dimmed by the strange heaviness that pervaded the valley. Finally, the wizard spoke, his voice gentle but carrying an authority that commanded attention. He assured them that he would investigate this matter thoroughly. Whatever was disturbing their rest, he would find it and, if possible, set it right. But he would need their patience and their trust. Such things rarely had simple solutions. Torald nodded wearily and offered Gandalf the use of a small cottage that stood empty at the edge of the village. Its previous occupant, an elderly widow, had passed away peacefully in her sleep the summer before, and her children had long since moved to larger towns. The cottage had been maintained but remained unoccupied, waiting for new tenants who had not yet arrived. It would serve well enough for the wizard's needs. Gandalf accepted gratefully and asked if someone might show him the way. The young man who had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting volunteered, rising slowly to his feet. His name was Alden, and though weariness lined his face, his eyes still held a spark of determination. As they walked through the village toward the cottage, Gandalf engaged the young man in quiet conversation. He learned that Alden had been among the first to experience the troubled dreams, and his account provided additional details that the wizard filed away in his vast store of knowledge. The dreams, Alden explained, were not frightening in the traditional sense. There were no monsters or terrors, no pursuit by dark things or falling into endless voids. Instead, they were characterized by a profound sense of searching, of looking for something that remained forever out of reach. It was the futility of it that wore one down, the endless walking through grey nothing toward a destination that never drew closer. The cottage stood beneath a pair of old apple trees, their branches now bare of fruit, but still graceful in the fading light. It was a modest dwelling, but clean and well-maintained, with a small garden plot and a neat stack of firewood beside the door. Alden helped Gandalf kindle a fire in the cottage hearth, though his movements were slow, and his hands trembled slightly with exhaustion. The wizard watched him with concern, noting how even this simple task seemed to drain what little energy the young man possessed. When the flames had taken hold and warmth began to spread through the small room, Gandalf insisted that Alden return home to rest, or at least to attempt it. The young man nodded gratefully and took his leave, his footsteps dragging as he made his way back toward the village centre. Through the window, Gandalf watched him go, a shadow among shadows in the gathering dusk. Once alone, the wizard set about making the cottage comfortable for his stay. His needs were simple, refined by centuries of wandering. He arranged his few belongings, hung his cloak on a peg by the door, and filled a kettle with water from the well outside to set above the fire for tea. As he worked, his mind turned over everything he had learned. The pattern of the affliction troubled him. It had spread too quickly and too completely to be natural, yet there was no sense of active malevolence, no feeling of deliberate attack. It was more as though something had gone wrong with the very fabric of dreaming itself in this place, as though a door that should remain open had been blocked, or a stream that should flow freely had been dammed. As full darkness fell over the valley, Gandalf stood at the cottage window and gazed out at the night. The stars were beginning to emerge, cold and distant in the autumn sky. A thin crescent moon hung above the eastern hills, its pale light barely touching the shadowed landscape. The village was quiet, unnaturally so. No voices carried on the evening air. No laughter or song drifted from the cottages. Even the usual sounds of animals settling for the night seemed muted and subdued. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of exhaustion, of a community too weary even for the comfort of companionship. The wizard prepared a simple meal from provisions in his pack, bread and cheese, and a handful of dried fruit. As he ate, he considered his next steps. He would need to explore the valley thoroughly, to search for any signs of disturbance or unnatural presence. He would need to speak with more of the villagers, to gather as much information as possible about the onset and nature of their affliction. But most importantly, he would need to experience the phenomenon himself. Only by walking the grey paths they described could he truly understand what was happening. The prospect did not please him, for he suspected that even his considerable strength might be tested by whatever force was at work here. But there was no other way. After his meal, Gandalf sat by the fire and smoked his pipe, drawing comfort from the familiar ritual. The tobacco was a blend from the Shire, sweet and mellow, and its smoke curled upward in lazy spirals toward the rafters. He let his mind drift, not thinking directly about the problem, but allowing his thoughts to wander in the way that often led to unexpected insights. He thought of other times he had encountered disruptions in the natural order, other places where the boundaries between the waking world and the realm of dreams had grown thin or troubled. Most such instances had involved deliberate magic, the workings of those who sought power over the minds of others. But this felt different. There was an almost accidental quality to it, as though something had been disturbed inadvertently, rather than set in motion with purpose. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Gandalf finally prepared himself for sleep. He added several logs to the hearth, ensuring the fire would burn through the night, and arranged his bedroll near its warmth. Before lying down, he stood for a moment, with his eyes closed, centering himself and drawing upon the deep reserves of power that were his by nature and long study. He wrapped himself in protections, subtle wards that would preserve his essential self, even if his mind wandered into dangerous territory. Then, with a final glance around the quiet cottage, he settled himself and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, more quickly than he had expected. One moment he was aware of the warmth of the fire and the soft crackling of burning wood, and the next he was standing in a place of grey mist. The transition was so smooth as to be almost unnoticeable, and that in itself was telling. Normally, The passage into dreams held a sense of descent, of moving from one state of being to another. But this was different. It was as though the grey place had been waiting just beyond the threshold of waking, ready to draw him in the moment his consciousness relaxed its grip on the physical world. Gandalf looked around, his wizard's senses sharp even in this strange realm. The mist pressed close on all sides, thick and uniform, neither rising nor falling but simply existing as a constant presence. There was no ground beneath his feet, or rather, the ground was indistinguishable from the mist itself. When he took a step, his foot found purchase, but he could not see what he walked upon. The light, if it could be called light, came from everywhere and nowhere, a grey illumination that revealed nothing clearly. There were no landmarks, no features to orient himself by. He could not tell if the space around him was vast or confined, open or enclosed. He began to walk, choosing a direction at random since all directions seemed equally grey and featureless. As he moved through the mist, he became aware of other presences. They were not visible, but he could sense them, other dreamers wandering as he did. Their presence felt distant and muffled, as though they moved in parallel spaces that occasionally brushed against his own. Sometimes he thought he glimpsed shadows in the mist, human-shaped but insubstantial, there one moment and gone the next. He called out once, his voice strong and clear, but it seemed to be absorbed by the greyness, travelling no distance at all. The sense of futility that Alden had described became apparent as Gandalf continued his wandering. There was a quality to this grey realm that resisted purpose and direction. No matter how deliberately Gandalf walked, no matter how clearly he fixed his intention on moving forward or finding an edge to this misty space, he seemed to make no progress. It was not that he was prevented from moving, but rather that movement itself had no meaning here. He could walk for what felt like hours, and yet remain in exactly the same place, surrounded by the same grey nothingness. It was deeply disorienting, and he began to understand how this experience, repeated night after night, would wear down even the strongest spirit. Yet Gandalf was no ordinary dreamer. He possessed knowledge and power that reached back through long ages, and he had walked in stranger places than this. Drawing upon that deep well of understanding, he stopped walking and instead turned his attention inward. If this realm resisted physical movement, perhaps it would respond to a different approach. He closed his eyes, though in this grey place the difference between seeing and not seeing was negligible, and he reached out with his mind, not searching for anything specific, but simply extending his awareness, feeling for the currents and patterns that underlay this strange space. At first, there was nothing. The greyness seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, uniform and unchanging. But as Gandalf maintained his focus, refusing to be distracted or discouraged, he began to perceive subtle variations. The mist was not quite as uniform as it first appeared. There were currents within it, gentle movements like slow eddies in still water, and beneath those currents, deeper still, he sensed something else. A pull, faint but persistent, drawing in a particular direction. It was not a physical pull, but rather a tug on the fabric of the dream itself, as though something was drawing all the wandering consciousnesses toward a central point. Gandalf opened his eyes and turned to face the direction of that pull. The mist looked no different than it had before, but now he had a heading, a purpose beyond random wandering. He began to walk again, but this time he did not simply move through the greyness. Instead, he aligned his movement with that subtle current he had detected, allowing it to guide him. The change was immediate. Where before his steps had seemed to carry him nowhere, now he felt actual progress. The mist began to shift around him, still grey but no longer quite so uniform. Shapes began to emerge, vague at first, but gradually becoming more defined. As he walked, following the current deeper into the heart of this dream realm, Gandalf began to understand more clearly what he was experiencing. This was not a natural dream space. Dreams, in their proper form, were individual experiences shaped by the mind of the dreamer. Each person's dreams were unique, reflecting their memories, fears, hopes, and the peculiar logic of the unconscious mind. But this grey place was different. It was a shared space, a communal realm into which all the sleepers of Thornley were being drawn. Instead of each person experiencing their own dreams, they were all wandering through the same featureless void. Their individual dream experiences collapsed into this single grey emptiness. The implications troubled the wizard deeply. Something had created this space, or perhaps had allowed it to form by disrupting the natural flow of dreaming. But to what purpose? There was still no sense of malevolence, no feeling that some dark intelligence was feeding on the sleeper's distress. It was more as though this grey realm existed as an unintended consequence of some other action or event, a side effect rather than a deliberate creation. The question was, what had caused it, and how could it be undone? The shapes in the mist grew more distinct as Gandalf pressed forward. He began to make out what appeared to be walls, though they were translucent and insubstantial, more the suggestion of walls than actual barriers. They formed a corridor of sorts, and the current he followed ran along its length like water through a channel. Other dreamers drifted past him now, their forms more visible here than they had been in the open greyness. He recognized some of them from his meeting in the village hall. They moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes open but unseeing, their faces slack with exhaustion. They did not seem to notice him, even when he stepped directly into their path. They simply flowed around him like water around a stone. The corridor led steadily downward, though there was no visible slope. Gandalf simply knew that he was descending, moving deeper into whatever lay at the heart of this realm. The mist grew thicker as he went, taking on a texture almost like cloth, pressing against him with gentle but insistent pressure. The walls on either side became more solid, their surfaces beginning to show detail. He could make out patterns now, swirling designs that reminded him of water or smoke, constantly moving but never quite resolving into anything recognizable. The overall effect was dreamlike in the extreme, a place where reality became fluid and uncertain. After what might have been minutes or hours, time having little meaning in this place, Gandalf came to what appeared to be a doorway. It was formed of the same grey mist as everything else, but it was clearly an opening, a threshold between one space and another. The current that had guided him thus far flowed directly through it, and he could sense that whatever lay beyond was the source of the pull that drew all the wandering sleepers. He paused at the threshold, gathering his strength and reinforcing his protections. Whatever waited beyond that doorway was the key to understanding this affliction. He was certain of that. But it might also be dangerous in ways he could not yet anticipate. Steeling himself, Gandalf stepped through the doorway and found himself in a chamber that defied the greyness that had surrounded him until now. The space was vast, its walls curving upward and inward to form a dome high overhead. And unlike the uniform grey of the corridors, this chamber was filled with colour and light. But the colours were wrong somehow. Too bright and too vivid, clashing against each other in combinations that hurt to look at directly. At the centre of the chamber, suspended in the air as though held by invisible threads, was a crystal. It was roughly the size of a man's head, multifaceted and gleaming with an inner light that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. The light it gave off was the source of the chaotic colours that filled the space, each facet seeming to emit a different hue that bled into and fought with its neighbours. Gandalf recognised the crystal immediately, though he had not seen one in many long years. It was a dreamstone, an artefact of the Elder Days, crafted by those who had sought to walk the paths between waking and sleeping with greater ease and understanding. Dreamstones were not inherently evil things, though they were dangerous in their way. They acted as anchors and amplifiers for dream experiences, allowing the user to shape and direct their sleeping visions with unusual clarity and purpose. In the hands of the wise and careful, they could be tools of great benefit, aids to healing and understanding. But they were also delicate things, requiring constant attention and proper use. If neglected or misused, they could become corrupted, their function twisted into something harmful. And this dreamstone, Gandalf could see at once, had been left alone for far too long. The crystal's pulsing light was irregular, stuttering in a way that suggested damage or distortion. Instead of facilitating individual dreams, it had apparently begun to pull all nearby sleepers into a single shared space, creating the grey void through which Gandalf had just travelled. The dreamers of Thornley were being drawn to the stone each night, their individual dream experiences collapsed into the featureless mist, because the stone no longer possessed the clarity to maintain separate dream paths. It was like a bell that had cracked, producing only a dull, discordant tone instead of clear music. Gandalf approached the crystal cautiously, his staff held ready though he doubted it would be needed. As he drew closer, he could see the flaw in the stone more clearly. A hairline crack ran through one section, barely visible but significant enough to disrupt the crystal's function. Around the crack, the facets were clouded, their usual transparency marred by a milky opacity. This was the source of the problem, the reason for the grey mist and the exhausted village. The dreamstone was broken, and in its broken state, it was pulling in the dreams of everyone within its considerable range, trapping them in an endless, purposeless wandering. But how had the stone come to be here, hidden beneath a small village in a remote valley? And who had placed it, and for what purpose? Gandalf turned his attention to the chamber itself, looking for clues. The walls, now that he examined them more carefully, bore faint traces of carved symbols. They were very old, their lines worn almost smooth by the passage of time. But the wizard's keen eyes could still make out their general shape. They were protective wards, he realized, meant to shield the chamber and its contents from outside interference. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide and guard this dreamstone. As he studied the chamber, fragments of understanding began to come together in Gandalf's mind. This place, this hidden room beneath the valley, was far older than the village above. Perhaps it predated the village by centuries or even ages. Someone, long ago, had placed the dreamstone here, possibly as part of some larger working now lost to memory. The wards suggested that whoever had done so knew the stone needed protection, needed to be kept safe and undisturbed. But the wards had weakened over time, as all such things eventually did, and the stone had been left without the care it required. The crack in the crystal might have formed naturally, a consequence of age and stress, or it might have resulted from some external shock, an earthquake perhaps, or some other disturbance. Regardless of how it had happened, the result was clear. The stone's function had been compromised, and now it was causing harm rather than providing the benefits for which it had been created. The people of Thornley, living unknowingly above this ancient artifact, had been pulled into its sphere of influence, their dreams disrupted by its malfunctioning presence. Gandalf reached out with one hand, stopping just short of touching the crystal's surface. Even from this close distance, he could feel the power it contained, a deep thrumming that resonated in his bones. The stone was still trying to fulfill its purpose, still attempting to facilitate the passage between waking and dreaming. But its damaged state meant it could no longer do so properly. Instead of creating clear pathways for individual dreamers, it created only the grey void, a space without direction or purpose. Night after night, the sleepers of Thornley were drawn here, wandering through the mist in search of rest they could never find, returning to waking more exhausted than when they had slept. The wizard stood in contemplation, considering his options. The simplest solution would be to destroy the dreamstone, to shatter it completely and end its influence over the valley. But that carried risks. A dreamstone, even a broken one, contained considerable power. Destroying it improperly might release that power in dangerous and unpredictable ways. It might even worsen the situation, creating a backlash that could harm the very people he sought to help. No, destruction was a last resort, to be considered only if gentler methods failed. The alternative was to repair the stone, to mend the crack, and restore its proper function. But that too presented challenges. Dreamstones were not made of ordinary crystal. They were woven from dream stuff and starlight, crafted according to arts that had been lost for long ages. Gandalf possessed considerable knowledge and power, but crystal craft of this particular kind was not among his primary skills. Still, he was not without resources. The wizard closed his eyes and reached deeper into his memory, searching through the accumulated knowledge of his long years. He had encountered dreamstones before, though not often, and he had spoken with those who understood their nature more fully than he. There were techniques, he recalled, methods that did not require the full craft of making but could be used to stabilize and soothe the damaged stone. They involved not so much repairing the physical crack as harmonizing the stone's energy, helping it to find a new balance despite its flaw. Gandalf began to circle the suspended crystal slowly, observing it from all angles. The crack was visible from only certain positions, and the clouding around it seemed to shift and change as he moved. He noted the pattern of the pulsing light, counting the rhythm and observing how it stuttered. There was still order within the chaos, a remnant of the stone's original purpose trying to assert itself. That was promising. If enough of the original structure remained intact, it might be possible to work with what was there rather than attempting to restore what had been lost. The wizard extended both hands toward the crystal, palms open, fingers spread. He did not touch it, but held his hands close enough to feel the flow of energy emanating from its surface. The power was considerable, a deep well of potential that had been accumulating over who knew how many years, but it was turbulent, moving in cross-currents and eddies rather than the smooth flow it should have maintained. Gandalf began to hum, a low note that resonated in the chamber. It was not a spell precisely, but rather a tuning, an attempt to find the frequency at which the stone naturally vibrated. For a long while, there was no response. The crystal continued its irregular pulsing. The chaotic colors continued their clashing dance. But Gandalf persisted, adjusting his tone slightly, seeking the right pitch. And then, so subtly that he almost missed it, the stone's pulse shifted. Just for a moment, it synchronized with his humming, and the colors dimmed slightly, becoming less harsh. Encouraged, the wizard held that note, sustaining it with the steady breath control that came from centuries of practice. Gradually, the stone began to respond more consistently. Its pulsing slowed and became more regular, matching the rhythm of Gandalf's sustained tone. The colors, while still bright, began to separate from each other, no longer bleeding together in that painful way. The wizard could feel the energy within the crystal starting to smooth out, the turbulent eddies giving way to something more ordered. It was like calming a frightened horse, he thought. Not through force or domination, but through patience and gentle persistence. As the crystal's energy stabilized, Gandalf became aware of a change in the dream realm around him. The chamber itself began to shift, its walls becoming less solid, more transparent. Through them, he could see out into the grey void beyond, and what he saw filled him with cautious hope. The mist was thinning, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less dense, less oppressive, and in the clearing mist, he could see the shadowy forms of other dreamers more clearly now. They had stopped their aimless wandering and stood still, as though waiting for something. The wizard maintained his humming, but began to add layers to it, soft harmonics that wove around the fundamental tone, creating a more complex pattern. He was attempting something delicate now, trying to guide the dreamstone toward a new configuration. Since the crack could not be physically repaired without specialized knowledge he did not possess, he would instead teach the stone to work around it. Like a river finding a new course around a fallen boulder, the energy within the crystal could be directed to flow in ways that avoided the damaged area. It required intense concentration. Gandalf had to hold multiple patterns in his mind simultaneously, maintaining the primary tone while introducing variations that would encourage the stone to reshape its internal pathways. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the dreamlike nature of his surroundings. This was demanding work, pushing the limits of his skill and endurance. But slowly, incrementally, he felt the stone responding. Its light began to pulse in a more complex pattern, no longer the simple on-off rhythm it had maintained before. The colors started to organize themselves, no longer random but flowing in waves that spiraled around the crystal's surface. Time lost all meaning as Gandalf worked. He existed in a state of pure focus, aware of nothing but the stone and the patterns he was weaving around and through it. His humming continued, rising and falling in subtle waves, each variation designed to coax the crystal toward greater harmony. And the stone, ancient and damaged though it was, responded to his efforts. Deep within its structure, energy paths that had been blocked by the crack began to find alternative routes. The stone was learning in its own way to adapt to its injury. Finally, after what might have been hours or might have been mere moments, Gandalf felt something shift fundamentally within the crystal. It was like a lock clicking into place, or a puzzle piece settling into its proper position. The stone's pulsing steadied into a rhythm that, while different from what it had likely maintained in its undamaged state, was nevertheless stable and harmonious. The colors settled into a gentle rotation, each hue taking its turn to dominate before fading into the next. Most importantly, the energy emanating from the stone smoothed into a steady flow, no longer turbulent or chaotic. The wizard let his humming fade gradually, carefully monitoring the stone to ensure it would maintain its new configuration without his active support. The crystal continued to pulse steadily, its light now warm rather than harsh. Around him, the chamber had transformed. The walls had become translucent, revealing a vista of what appeared to be normal dream space beyond. Instead of grey mist, there were colors and shapes, the fragmentary landscapes that characterized healthy dreaming. Gandalf watched as the shadowy forms of the other dreamers, no longer trapped in the grey void, began to drift away into their own individual dream spaces. Each one faded from view, pulled gently back into the private realms of their sleeping minds. It was like watching seeds scattered on the wind, each finding its own place to take root. The wizard felt a deep satisfaction at the sight. The dreamstone, though still cracked and imperfect, was now functioning in a way that supported, rather than hindered, the natural process of dreaming. It would never be what it once was, but it had found a new purpose, a different way of being that was sustainable and beneficial. As the last of the wandering dreamers disappeared into their own dreams, Gandalf felt the pull of waking consciousness beginning to assert itself. He had been in this dream realm for a considerable time, and his physical body was calling him back. He took a final look around the chamber, fixing its details in his memory. He would need to return here, in waking form, to ensure the stone's stability, and perhaps to place new wards that would protect it from future disturbance. But for now, his work in the dream realm was complete. The transition back to waking was gentle, a gradual rising through layers of consciousness like a swimmer ascending from deep water toward light. Gandalf became aware of the warmth of the fire in the cottage hearth, the softness of his bedroll beneath him, the familiar weight of his body. He opened his eyes to find pale dawn light filtering through the window, painting the cottage walls in soft shades of rose and gold. He lay still for a moment, taking stock of himself. He was tired, but it was the healthy tiredness that came from effort well spent, not the dragging exhaustion that plagued the villagers. Rising slowly, Gandalf added wood to the fire and set water to boil for tea. His movements were methodical and peaceful, the simple tasks grounding him fully in the waking world after his journey through the realm of dreams. As he waited for the water to heat, he stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sun had just cleared the eastern hills, and its golden light was spilling across the valley in gentle waves. The village was beginning to stir, and even from this distance, the wizard could sense a change in the atmosphere. The oppressive heaviness that had hung over Thornley was lifting. Not completely, not yet, but the difference was unmistakable. Gandalf could hear sounds that had been absent the previous day. A rooster crowing from someone's yard, the distant lowing of cattle. And was that children's laughter? Yes, faint but clear, the sound of young voices raised in play rather than distress. The wizard smiled, a warm expression that softened his weathered features. The Dreamstone's healing was already having an effect. He returned inside to find his water boiling. As he prepared his tea, there came a knock at the door. Gandalf opened it to find young Alden standing on the threshold, but this was a very different Alden from the exhausted youth of the previous evening. His eyes were bright, his face bore a healthy colour, and he stood straight rather than slumped with weariness. The change was remarkable, testament to the restorative power of a single night of proper sleep. Alden greeted the wizard with barely contained excitement, the words tumbling out in a rush. He had slept, truly slept, for the first time in weeks, and he had dreamed, real dreams of green fields and running water, of memories from his childhood and hopes for the future. When he woke, he felt renewed, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The same was true throughout the village. Everyone was speaking of it, marveling at the change. They wanted to thank Gandalf, to know what he had done to help them. The wizard invited the young man inside and poured him a cup of tea. As they sat by the fire, Gandalf explained what he had discovered, speaking in terms the young man could understand. He told of the ancient chamber beneath the valley, the dreamstone that had been placed there long ago, and how its damage had disrupted the natural flow of dreaming. He described how he had stabilized the stone, allowing it to function once more in a way that supported rather than hindered sleep. Alden listened with wide eyes, his tea growing cold in his hands as he absorbed the tale. But the wizard also cautioned him. The repair was not perfect, he explained. The stone would need to be monitored, checked regularly to ensure it maintained its new balance. And there might be lingering effects, minor disturbances as the village adjusted to having their normal dreams restored. He asked Alden to spread word that if anyone experienced difficulties, they should inform him at once. The young man nodded seriously, understanding the importance of vigilance. As the morning progressed, more villagers came to the cottage, each bearing the same story of restored sleep and grateful hearts. Gandalf welcomed them all, accepting their thanks with gentle humility. He assured them that the worst was past, that their nights would continue to improve, as the Dreamstone settled more fully into its new pattern. Mara, the healer, came with tears of joy in her eyes, reporting that even the babies had slept peacefully through the night, and the elderly were showing remarkable improvement in their strength and spirits. By midday, the village had transformed from a place of shadow and exhaustion to something approaching its former vitality. Gandalf took advantage of the improved spirits to make a request of Tyrhold and the other village elders. He needed to locate the physical chamber that housed the Dreamstone, the actual place beneath the valley where the crystal resided. In the Dream Realm, he had found it easily enough, but the waking world did not always correspond directly to the geography of dreams. The chamber could be anywhere within a certain radius of the village, hidden beneath earth and stone, accessible only through passages that might have long since collapsed or been deliberately sealed. Tyrhold listened thoughtfully to the wizard's description of what he sought: an underground chamber, old beyond reckoning, with walls carved with protective symbols and a domed ceiling. After some discussion among the elders, one of them, an ancient man named Cedric, spoke up. He remembered, he said, stories his grandfather had told of caves in the hillside to the north of the village. They had been considered dangerous, prone to collapse, and had been sealed off generations ago. But the location and description matched what Gandalf described well enough to be worth investigating. The wizard set out that afternoon, accompanied by Alden and several other volunteers who were eager to help. The restored sleep had given them energy to spare, and they were determined to assist the one who had saved them. They made their way along an overgrown path that led up into the hills, pushing through brambles and undergrowth that spoke of long years of neglect. The autumn sun was warm on their backs, and birds sang in the trees around them, their melodies a cheerful counterpoint to the serious nature of their mission. After perhaps an hour of steady climbing, they came to a place where the hillside fell away in a small cliff face. At its base, nearly hidden by fallen stones and tangled vines, was an opening. It was small, barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, and it was clear that at one time it had been much larger before being deliberately filled in. Gandalf examined the stones that blocked the entrance, noting their arrangement. Yes, this had been sealed intentionally, and with some care. Someone had wanted to ensure this entrance remained closed. With the help of the villagers, Gandalf began to carefully remove the stones. It was slow work, for they needed to avoid causing a collapse that might seal the passage permanently, or worse, bring down the hillside above them. Each stone was lifted away with care and set aside, gradually revealing more of the opening. As they worked, the wizard could feel a faint resonance, a tingling in the air that confirmed they were on the right track. The Dreamstone was close, somewhere in the darkness beyond this entrance. When the opening was finally large enough to admit passage, Gandalf lit his staff, its tip glowing with a soft white radiance that pushed back the shadows. He instructed the villagers to wait outside while he explored ahead. If the passages were unstable, there was no point in risking multiple lives. Alden protested, wanting to accompany the wizard, but Gandalf was firm. He would go alone first, assess the safety of the route, and return for them if it proved secure enough for others to follow. The passage beyond the entrance was narrow and low, forcing Gandalf to stoop as he made his way forward. The walls were rough stone, unworked, except for the occasional support timber that had been placed in ages past. Most of these timbers had rotted away, leaving only dark stains on the stone where they had once stood. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of earth and ancient darkness. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady rhythm that echoed strangely in the confined space. As Gandalf progressed deeper into the hillside, the passage began to descend. The floor became a series of natural stone steps, worn smooth by the passage of water over countless years. His staff light revealed mineral deposits on the walls, gleaming streaks of white and gold that caught the radiance and threw it back in glittering patterns. It was beautiful in its way, this hidden realm beneath the earth, untouched by sun or wind for generations. The passage opened suddenly into a larger space, and Gandalf found himself standing in the chamber he had visited in dreams. But seeing it in waking form was a different experience entirely. The dome overhead was crusted with crystals, natural formations that must have taken ages to grow. They caught the light from his staff and filled the chamber with a gentle, diffused glow. The walls, which had seemed translucent in dreams, were solid stone here, their carved symbols clearly visible now in the improved light. At the center of the chamber, just as he had seen in the dream realm, the Dreamstone floated in the air. or so it appeared at first glance. Looking more closely, Gandalf could see that it rested on a pedestal of carved stone, so perfectly balanced and so aligned with the natural energies of the place that it seemed to hover unsupported. The crystal itself was even more beautiful in physical form than it had been in dreams. Despite its crack, despite the clouding around the damaged area, it was a work of extraordinary craftsmanship, gleaming with inner light and subtle power. Gandalf approached it slowly, reverently. This was a thing of the elder days, created by hands and minds that had understood the deep connections between the material world and the realm of dreams. To stand in its presence was to touch, however briefly, the wisdom and skill of an age long past. The wizard extended his hand and laid his palm gently on the stone's surface. It was warm to the touch, and he could feel the steady pulse of energy within it, the new rhythm he had helped it find during his dream journey. The crack was visible as a thin, dark line across one facet, and around it, the clouding created a small area of opacity in the otherwise clear crystal. Gandalf stood in quiet contemplation, his hand resting on the dreamstone's warm surface. He could feel the steady rhythm of its pulse, the energy flowing through new pathways he had helped it establish. The stone was stable now, but stability was not the same as security. This chamber had lain hidden and protected for long ages, but the wards that had once guarded it had weakened with time. If the stone was to continue serving its purpose without causing harm, those protections would need to be renewed and strengthened. The wizard began to walk slowly around the chamber, examining the carved symbols on the walls. They were written in a script he recognized, though it had not been commonly used for many centuries. The language was one of the precursors to the tongues spoken by men in the northern lands, and the wards themselves were elegantly constructed, woven together in patterns that reinforced and supported each other. Whoever had created this place had possessed considerable skill in the protective arts, but even the finest ward would eventually fade if not maintained, and these had clearly gone untended for generations. Using his staff as a focus, Gandalf began the work of restoration. He traced the carved symbols with the tip of his staff, speaking words of power softly as he went. The words were in an older tongue still, one that reached back to the early days of Middle-earth, when the world was young and magic flowed more freely. As he spoke, the carved symbols began to glow with a faint silver light, responding to the renewal of their purpose. It was delicate work, requiring precision and care. Each symbol had to be reawakened individually, and the connections between them had to be re-established in the proper sequence. The process took considerable time and effort. Gandalf moved methodically around the chamber, his staff trailing silver light as he progressed. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the underground space, and he could feel the drain on his strength as he poured energy into the ancient wards. But gradually, the chamber began to change. The air itself seemed to thicken slightly, taking on a quality of presence that had been absent before. The wards were coming alive again, weaving an invisible barrier between this sacred space and the world beyond. When he had completed the circuit of the walls, Gandalf turned his attention to the Dreamstone itself. The crystal would benefit from its own protections, separate from but complementary to the chamber's wards. He raised his staff and began to inscribe patterns in the air around the floating stone, leaving trails of light that hung suspended like gossamer threads. The patterns were complex, spiraling inward toward the crystal in ever-tightening curves, creating a web of protection that would shield the Dreamstone from casual interference while still allowing it to fulfill its function. As the final thread of light settled into place, the entire web flared briefly with brilliant radiance before fading to near invisibility. Only the faintest shimmer remained, visible only if one knew to look for it. Gandalf stepped back and surveyed his work with satisfaction. The Dreamstone was now as secure as he could make it. The wards would protect it from physical disturbance and magical tampering alike, while still permitting the stone to interact with the dreams of those who slept within its range. It would continue to serve the village, but in a gentle way, supporting rather than disrupting their natural rest. The wizard made his way back through the passage to the surface, emerging into the late afternoon sunlight with relief. The villagers who had waited patiently outside pressed forward with questions, eager to know what he had found. Gandalf assured them that all was well. The chamber was secure, the stone protected. He advised them that the entrance should be sealed once more, though perhaps not as thoroughly as before. It should remain accessible in case future need arose. but it should not be left open to casual discovery. The return to the village was accomplished in good spirits, the group talking and laughing as they descended the hillside. The contrast with the previous day's oppressive silence was striking. Thornley was healing, its people rediscovering the simple joys that exhaustion had stolen from them. Children ran and played on the village green. Smoke rose cheerfully from cottage chimneys as evening meals were prepared. The sound of singing drifted from one of the homes, a mother's lullaby to her child. That evening, the village held a gathering in Gandalf's honor. It was nothing elaborate, merely a simple meal shared among neighbors, but it was offered with genuine warmth and gratitude. The wizard sat among them, accepting their thanks with grace and enjoying the honest food and good company. He told them stories of his travels, carefully chosen tales of hope and courage that would give them strength in the days to come. The villagers listened raptly, and for a few hours, their small community felt connected to the larger world beyond their valley. As the gathering drew to a close and people began to drift back to their homes, Tolkien approached Gandalf with a question. How long would the wizard's repairs last? Would they need to worry about the Dreamstone causing problems again in the future? Gandalf considered his answer carefully before responding. The wards he had placed were strong, he said, and should endure for many years. But nothing in Middle-earth lasted forever. Eventually, perhaps in a generation or perhaps in several, someone would need to check on the chamber and renew the protections if necessary. He suggested that the village might consider appointing a guardian, someone who would take responsibility for maintaining watch over the hidden chamber. It need not be an onerous duty, merely a matter of visiting the place once each season to ensure all remained well. Tolkien nodded thoughtfully, already considering who among the villagers might be suited to such a role. Young Alden, perhaps, who had shown both courage and wisdom beyond his years. As Gandalf walked back to his cottage through the quiet village, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and autumn leaves. The wizard paused near the old rowan tree on the village green, looking up at the emerging constellations. They were the same stars that had watched over Middle-earth for ages beyond counting, constant and eternal in their slow dance across the heavens. Seeing them brought a sense of perspective, a reminder that the troubles of mortals, however significant they seemed in the moment, were but brief episodes in the long story of the world. That night, Gandalf slept peacefully in the cottage beneath the apple trees. His dreams were his own, gentle wanderings through memories of green places and quiet moments collected over his long years. When he woke with the dawn, he felt refreshed and ready to continue his journey. There were other places that needed his attention, other folk who might benefit from his counsel and aid. The road called to him, as it always did, an endless ribbon unwinding through the lands of Middle-earth, and he was eager to follow where it led. He spent the morning making preparations for departure, packing his few belongings and ensuring the cottage was left clean and orderly for whoever might use it next. As he worked, several villagers stopped by to bid him farewell. Each brought small gifts, tokens of their gratitude that Gandalf accepted with gentle protests. A loaf of fresh bread from the baker, still warm from the oven. A small jar of honey gathered from hives kept in the meadow beyond the village. A warm scarf knitted by one of the elderly women, its stitches neat and even. These simple offerings touched the wizard more deeply than rich gifts ever could, for they represented genuine appreciation and affection. Mara came with a pouch of healing herbs, carefully dried and labelled. She thanked him again for what he had done, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. The children of the village, she told him, were thriving again. Their laughter had returned, and their play was full of energy and joy. The elderly were regaining their strength day by day. Even the livestock seemed healthier, the cows giving richer milk and the chickens laying more abundantly. It was as though the entire valley had been holding its breath and could now exhale freely. Young Alden arrived as Gandalf was securing his pack, ready to travel. The wizard smiled at the sight of him, noting again the remarkable transformation from the exhausted youth he had first met. Torald and the other elders had indeed approached Alden about serving as guardian of the Dreamstone Chamber, and the young man had accepted with solemn pride. He wanted to thank Gandalf personally and to promise that he would fulfill his duty faithfully. The wizard placed a hand on Alden's shoulder and offered words of encouragement and advice. The task was important, he said, but it should not become a burden. The stone was stable now and would remain so with only light attention. Trust in your instincts, Gandalf counseled, and do not hesitate to seek help if anything seems amiss. As the sun climbed toward midday, Gandalf took his leave of Thornley. The entire village had gathered on the green to see him off. A sea of faces, both young and old, all bearing expressions of fondness and gratitude. The wizard raised his staff in farewell, his grey robes billowing in the autumn breeze. He spoke a few final words, wishing them peace and prosperity, urging them to remember that even the smallest act of kindness could make a difference in the world. Then he turned and walked toward the track that led out of the valley, his staff tapping a steady rhythm against the earth. The villagers watched until he had climbed the rise and disappeared from view, his grey form blending gradually into the landscape, until it seemed he had become part of the hills themselves. Then, slowly, they dispersed back to their daily tasks, carrying with them the memory of the wandering wizard who had come when they needed him most, and had restored what they had feared was lost forever. Gandalf walked through the golden afternoon, following paths that only he seemed to know, guided by purposes that reached beyond the immediate and the obvious. Behind him, the Valley of Thornley settled into a peaceful routine, its people sleeping soundly each night, their dreams their own once more. The Dreamstone pulsed gently in its hidden chamber, watching over them as it had been created to do, finding in its new purpose a kind of redemption for its long years of troubled dysfunction. In the seasons that followed, Alden would visit the chamber regularly, descending into the earth to check on the glowing crystal and the wards that protected it. He would find it always, as Gandalf had left it, steady and serene, asking nothing, but offering much. Over time, he would learn the rhythms of the stone, understanding instinctively when it needed attention, and when it was best left undisturbed. And eventually, when his own children were grown, he would pass the guardianship to his eldest daughter, who would in turn pass it to her son, creating a chain of watchers that would extend down through the generations. The story of the Grey Wizard who had come to Thornley and healed their dreams would be told and retold, growing with each telling until it took on the quality of legend. Parents would speak of it to their children at bedtime, a tale of hope and restoration that eased the transition into sleep, and though the details might blur with time, the essential truth remained. In their darkest hour, when exhaustion threatened to overcome them entirely, help had come in the form of a wandering wizard who asked nothing for himself, but gave freely of his wisdom and power. And somewhere on the long roads of Middle-earth, Gandalf the Grey continued his endless journeying, carrying with him the knowledge that in one small valley, peace had been restored, and dreams once more flowed gently through the minds of sleeping souls. It was enough. It was always enough. For in the end, it was these small victories, these quiet moments of healing and hope, that held back the darkness and kept the light alive in the world.